IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. Ryan, this is a bit of a special edition. Tonight, we're going to talk about the potential offensive coordinator candidates for Notre Dame. We're going to kind of look at this twofold, Ryan. Obviously, we've been doing some digging. We've got some early names to know, some guys we're going to look into, and we're also going to kind of get into some guys we think Notre Dame should look into. And we'll kind of talk about what all this means for Notre Dame and with Tommy Rees leaving and what Notre Dame needs to look for specifically, because I think what they need to look for, Ryan, is every bit as important as us giving you a bunch of names. There's a type of coach that needs to be successful, and we're not talking about schematically per se, but a lot of other aspects, and so that's what we're going to dive into. But look, Ryan, here's the deal. Anytime a coach leaves, if you think highly of him or poorly of him, it presents an opportunity for the head coach. And the interesting thing that this opportunity kind of gives Marcus Freeman is, here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to do this whole, well, we didn't actually really like Tommy Rees, and we're glad he's gone and all that. Like, look, he's gone. Whether you liked him or not, he's gone. The opportunity is the same here for Marcus Freeman, whether you like Tommy Rees or not, right? It is, you have a chance to move the needle for your program. Because one thing I wholeheartedly believe, Ryan, is that this roster is built to where if a couple things can go right for you, you've got a chance to make a run this year. Right. One of the best lines in the country, a loaded backfield, unproven but very skilled group of pass catchers. Defense is a question mark right now, but it's good enough at some spots that if your offense is good enough, you can go out there and make a run. And so this hire needs to be about finding someone that right now makes Notre Dame a contender and not a guy that you think in a couple years of grooming could be that guy. And you need to find someone that you believe can come in right now and be that missing link to getting you to that next step. And that's really the key for Marcus Freeman here and what's in front of him. And in order to make that kind of move, I wrote an article about this, Ryan, he's got to be bold. Be willing to be told no by some guys that you think are dynamic. Don't make a hire and then go back and find out at next year's coaches convention like, gee, I wish you would have reached out to me because I was very interested with some dude that would have been a needle mover. Be bold. Do it quickly, but be bold. I think those are going to be the keys for Marcus Freeman as far as going out there and saying, hey, this is an opportunity for me to completely remake the program, because when he makes this move, the most veteran coach on the staff, as far as who's been here the longest, is Mike Mickens. So this is going to be Marcus Freeman's coaching staff, and there will be no BK holdovers or anything like that. That's all gone. It's your chance to make this program how you want it to be. And I think that's one that Marcus Freeman's going to embrace, Ryan.
I mean, he has to, right? I mean, it's obviously forced upon a little bit, but I know people have already always talked about that, even coming into the, last offseason, is that, Marcus had to obviously be open to Tommy staying on the staff and being his offensive coordinator, but it wasn't like it was fully open and that was his pick, right? It wasn't that type of situation. So
I think it would have been, but you're correct. Right. Tommy Rees is going to be the OC whether Marcus Freeman wanted him to or not. I think Marcus Freeman would have hired him anyway, but it was the same process. Correct.
Yeah. And we talked about Coach Freeman putting his stamp on this program, right? And feels like it's the final part of the stamp, right? Like who the coaching staff going into 2023, is the coaching staff that is fully Marcus Freeman's. Like there's no doubt. Like this is his baby. This is his product. And it's going to be interesting to see because, I mean, the process doesn't change, right? I mean, we've talked about this a ton. Notre Dame thinks that they are ready to compete for a championship in 2023. And obviously, Coach Rees was a part of that goal, but the goal doesn't change just because of Tommy leaves, right? Like it's just going to look a little different. So I think it's embracing the process and understanding that one coach is not going to define the process, right? This is Marcus Freeman's vision. This is Notre Dame's vision. And whoever it is has to embrace what the goals and the standards are at Notre Dame, obviously. And Coach Freeman needs to find the guy that he knows and he believes can be a part of the process that he is setting forth. And I think that it's a great opportunity because there's a lot of guys, especially tonight, that we're going to talk about that are varying ages, varying levels of experience, varying backgrounds as far as offensively. And I really think that there was a big pool of coaches that Coach Freeman could go to that, yes, it's still going to assimilate to an identity that he wants as his offensive coordinator, but ultimately they can bring different wrinkles to the table. They can bring different just strategies and just understanding of different types of offenses, which at the end of the day, that all the back and forth and conversations need to happen. There needs to be some compromising between what you want to do and who you are. And I think that there's a lot of different coaches that we'll talk about tonight that could potentially add a different level of at least creativity and just the variables that they want to bring to the offensive side of the football. So, I mean, there's an endless amount of possibilities. And just looking at this list that we prepared for tonight, Brian, it's just like there's a lot of different styles here, man, like a lot of different types of cats. And that's good. I think you need those options. And we're going to see very shortly who Marcus Freeman wants to be offensively even more thoroughly, in my opinion. You're on mute, Brian.
Just what happens. I'm scrolling through something else, so I don't see you doing this. Yep, I did it. There's a couple things that, number one, I want people in the chat to chill out with some of the stuff about so-and-so's gone and all. Just we said it before. Just stop. Okay, just please stop. Right? Let's focus on what we know and some of the things we think about candidates or whatever, but enough with all the this guy's leaving or that guy's leaving stuff, okay? Just stop. But here's the thing too. Number two, here's how coaching searches work. And it's the same thing when everybody kept telling me that Luke Fickell was the guy that Notre Dame wanted. That was never true. That was Luke Fickell's people floating that out there to create interest from Notre Dame and to kind of create that movement. What happens now is you're going to have agents of coaches who want this job leaking things to, especially if they've heard from Notre Dame, leaking things to the media about who the top candidate is so that they can generate buzz to either A, hopefully get the job, or B, use that as leverage at their current job. So I would encourage you to chill on thinking that ESPN is going to have the scoop on this stuff, okay? If you're hearing about who the top candidate is, remember those are the same people that told you Luke Fickell was the top candidate for this head coaching job a year ago. All right. So it doesn't mean that those guys aren't in the running, but if you're hearing someone tonight and February 3rd saying so-and-so is the top candidate or the guy that Notre Dame is keying on, I can promise you that there's more than one guy right now that Notre Dame is doing serious work on right now. I can promise you that. Okay. That's not an assumption. That's not a guess. Okay. So hear what I'm saying. So let's focus on some of these guys. Now, some of these guys are guys that I've been told Notre Dame likes. And the good thing is everyone that we're told Notre Dame is looking at early is already on our list. And then there's some other guys we're going to talk about that we think could be candidates that could fit what we're looking for. And so what are some of those things, Ryan, that you're looking for in an OC? Number one, and this is a big thing, and this is something that I've been told, is someone that can fit with Harry Hiestand is going to be important. Okay, so the Harry Hiestand aspect is going to be key. And then the staff as a whole. The staff as a whole is going to be key because Marcus Freeman really likes this offensive staff a lot. And if you remember correctly, last year at this time, there was a couple coaches that Marcus Freeman was looking at that wanted the control to come in and hire their own staff. And Coach Freeman said, it's not happening. I have guys in place that I want, that I like. We're going to roll with them. Yep. And I think that also is something that I would push back on, this notion that, well, Tommy Rees is the one who picked the current offensive staff. No, he didn't. Tommy Rees had a say. Marcus Freeman put a lot of stock in what Tommy Rees said because you want your offensive coordinator to be with people that you fit in. Well, it's kind of reversed this year. You need to bring in an offensive coordinator that can fit with your staff, but now it's the offensive coordinator that has to fit, not so much the assistant coaches that are going to fit with Tommy like it was last year. But they were Marcus Freeman's hires. He pushed for them, and they're guys that he wanted, okay? So I promise you, Dylan McCullough, Tommy Notre Dame, had a lot more to do with Marcus Freeman than Tommy Rees. Jared Parker had a lot more, and the minute Brian Kelly left, Harry Hiestand was reaching out no matter who the head coach was going to be, okay, because he wanted to come back. So I think that's the thing to remember there too. Staff fit's going to be very important. He wants an offense that's going to be balanced. He does not want an offense that's going to run for 300 yards and only throw for 120 because you don't win a championship that way. doesn't want an offense that's going to throw for 300 yards and run for 120 either, because I don't think you can win a championship that way. Even LSU could run for 200 yards if they needed to. And we've talked about that back in 2019. You need someone who is going to keep some level of scheme continuity, Ryan, meaning you're not going to go to an air raid. There needs to be some sort of carryover where you want to stick within somewhat of a pro style system, or someone who can adapt what the players know into what they do and vice versa. You're going to want someone who's a teacher. And this last one's mine. So those are things that we believe from our sources and people we've talked to are very important things for Notre Dame. Those aren't necessarily our opinions. This last one is my opinion. You need to hire someone who knows how to teach young people. Like freshmen and sophomores, because bringing in a coach who is going to be a veteran only, you got to be in the system for 3 years kind of guy is not going to fly. You need to come in with someone who can say, hey, look, we're going to be able to teach young people. And that's important for two reasons. Number one, you've got a lot of talented young players you need to get ready. Number two, if it's hard for young players to learn your system and they need multiple years, then it's going to get harder for you to transition an entire offense into what you do. And there's going to be too much of a learning curve. So those two things are going to be key. If you have a coach that has a proven track record of being able to win with younger players, then that's something I want to talk about, because that means you'll be able to make that kind of transition smooth, right? So I think, Ryan, those are things that are going to be very important for whoever the offensive coordinator is going to be. He's going to have to be able to kind of check the boxes on all those categories. And notice I didn't say has to run this type of offense or have this type of, do this. It's about those type of things that are more structural.
Well, and I would say this too, Brian. I mean, back to the staff fit for a second. Look, anytime you have to change your coordinator, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's unsettling for a second because change is hard sometimes, right? And change is new and you have to kind of navigate through the whole process. But I don't think we talked enough about in the first show, because obviously it just happened. And I want to just, focus on this for a second, is that, to your point here, is that Notre Dame's offensive coaching staff is in a pretty good spot, right? I mean, you have assets really on this coaching staff, right? I mean, you have one of the best offensive line coaches, I would argue, ever, right? You have Harry Hiestand, who is the reputation he has. You have Chancey Stuckey, who took a big step forward with the wide receiver group and is recruiting his tail off so far. You have Dylan McCullough, who has spent time on the NFL and college level and has developed some great running backs during his career and is a really good recruiter himself. You have Jared Parker, who has experience as an offensive coordinator, has coached multiple positions at this point. I mean, you have a lot of assets offensively. And I know we talked about Marcus Freeman says he's not a guy that is a, expert on offensive side of the football. Well, the good news is that he's put an offensive staff together that will be a huge, huge asset to whoever the next offensive coordinator is. So change might be scary for some, and I totally get it. But regardless, I think that that Notre Dame has the absolute resources for this to be a pretty, seamless transition as much as it can be to bring a new coordinator in, because who the offensive staff is. And you have trust in what you have coaching the tight end position, coaching the wide receivers, coaching the offensive line, coaching the running backs. You have trust in what you have on this coaching staff. So I really think that, yes, you need to fit in with this coaching staff that you already have on the offensive side of the football. You need to fit into, just from a personality perspective, and be comfortable. But more than anything, I think the fact that you have this assembled already is a big sell to an offensive coordinator, because he's coming into a position where you don't have to worry about Dylan McCullough coaching running backs, right? He's going to do a great job. You don't have to worry about Harry Hiestand developing offensive linemen. His track record says that's not even going to be a slight issue. So I think it is a really big resource to have, to know that whoever the guy coming in the door is going to have a lot of help and a lot of resources to work with and a lot of good position coaches next to him. I really think that's huge.
Last thing too is the new OC doesn't necessarily have to be a quarterback's coach, from what I've been able to gather, because they think there's a potential for maybe a couple other people to move. But I think that's the ideal target right now, is someone who can coach quarterbacks. It's not going to be someone who can coach offensive line. There's a thought that potentially, Chancey Stuckey or Jared Parker could coach quarterbacks, with the experience they have, which I think it can be done, especially with a. Here's the other thing: this is the year to do it because you've got a 6th-year senior quarterback that doesn't need a lot of work.
Absolutely.
So let's dive into the candidates, Ryan, and let's first tell y'all who we're not going to be talking about tonight. Okay,
That's
we're
a great
not
starting
going to be
point. I like
talking
that.
about Cliff Kingsbury. Okay, we are not going to be talking about Warren Ruggiero. Okay, we're not going to be talking about Ken Niumatalolo. I don't know if people believe that or if they're actually just saying that to piss me off because they don't have the option.
Oh, someone said that in the
But
chat.
I've
That's funny.
seen that, and on the message board. But I think they were joking just to make me upset, just to try to poke the bear a little bit.
Paul Johnson,
Yeah,
Ken Niumatalolo.
right. But we're not going to be talking about Cliff Kingsbury. We're not going to talk about David Shaw because we already talked about him earlier in the podcast, and it's not a realistic candidate. If David Shaw wants the job, sure, okay, you listen to him because he's a great offensive mind, but that's just not. I mean, David Shaw's not going to do that, and we're not going to be talking about Brian Hartline for the reasons we talked in the show earlier. A, he's not leaving Ohio State. B, as I said before, you can't bring a learn-on-the-job guy in. Ohio State can get away with that because A, he's been in that system, and B, you have Ryan Day there to kind of help along the way. You don't have that at Notre Dame. So you're not going to have that, and we're not going to be talking about Charlie Weiss Jr. for a million reasons. So the list that we have, Ryan, are guys that we like, but also guys that we believe fit what we're looking for, what Notre Dame is looking for, and then also some guys that, we think there are some connections there and trying to draw some certain lines and some things that we've been told by some of our sources. I want to begin with a potential in-house candidate. I think it's only right to talk, to look at somebody who might be on the staff already who will get a look. And I do think Jared Parker there will be some conversations about Jared Parker. And let's talk about a couple reasons why. Number one, trust. There's nobody out there that Marcus Freeman is going to trust more than Jared Parker just from having my back and that kind of thing, right? You have to have that conversation. You and I have done a lot of digging on this, Ryan, with him at West Virginia, that he was basically told you're running Neil Brown's offense. It wasn't necessarily what he wants to do. So, he's a guy that has experience coaching at Penn State, coaching at Purdue, coaching in some other places. So I do think it's at least worth mentioning Jared Parker is a potential candidate because of like I said, he has experience calling the offense before. He's worked with David Cutcliffe, which to me means a lot. You know my stance on that, the fact that he spent 2 years working with David Cutcliffe. And of course, he has a guy that actually has coordinator experience, although he wasn't someone who necessarily ran his own offense. But that's kind of how it would be at Notre Dame. If they did promote Jared Parker, I'm not saying they're going to. We're just saying it's an option. And maybe do some like co-coordinator thing with like him as the coordinator and then like Dylan McCullough or Harry Heastan or something like that. Then, you would have a situation where there is that continuity that we talked about. They would basically run the offense that we've seen them run with some wrinkles. And the one thing I did see from Jared Parker at West Virginia, Ryan, is he runs a lot of RPOs. Yes. And, was very much a spread it out kind of guy. But again, that's more of a Neil Brown thing than necessarily a Jared Parker thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting look because I would also say, at West Virginia, his quarterback that year was Jared Dagey, right? And for people that don't remember Jared Dagey, he ended his career this year. I forget where he ended up transferring to, but he is a weaker armed quarterback, right? So sometimes people run RPOs out of necessity. It's not actually what they want to do. So I can't really comment on what his belief in the RPO system is. All we know is that he was under Neil Brown. Neil Brown was a very 11 personnel, 10 personnel type of system that just wanted to spread things out. There's a lot of air raidy type of feel to what Neil Brown does. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that's what Jared Parker believes in. It's what Jared Parker wants to do. But there was a big air raid emphasis. So you'll see a lot of wide splits from wide receivers. You'll see a lot of outside vertical stuff. You're just trying to isolate areas, basically. So that's kind of what you saw, and a lot of inside zone, a lot of RPO pull off of the inside zone as well. So that's kind of what you saw there. But again, we don't know if that's what Jared Parker really believed in, or if that is just a by factor of Neil Brown being the head coach, obviously.
And by the way, he went to Troy and got beat out. Yeah. By the way.
He's bad, man. He was a bad player.
Based on a conversation I had recently, I have a feeling that Jared Parker likes RPOs a lot. And I'll share that with you after the show, Ryan. I forgot to mention that to you. But I have a feeling based on a conversation that I had with some people that he's an RPO guy himself. So I think we'll see that. I think we'll see that in the offense because there's a lot of these guys who are like they use RPOs a whole lot more than Notre Dame does. So I think RPOs are certainly something that we'll see a lot more of moving forward. So I do think Jared Parker's a guy to keep in mind, right? There's a reason Marcus Freeman brought him on staff. Even if it's something as like a co-coordinator type of situation, maybe something like that'll happen. But that all depends on who he's able to bring in. I mean, it could be a thing where maybe you have to bring a guy in because we're going to kind of do a thing, and it's going to be more of a staff-generated thing. Maybe that's the route they might have to go if they can't get one of the more proven guys. We'll have to see about that, Ryan. But that is certainly something that is going to be interesting to look into.
And we've seen the co-coordinator thing work in certain spots, right? I mean, you think of like LSU 2019, which I know we'll have a deep conversation here in a couple minutes, right?
But yeah, that's the next guy that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, but they did the co-coordinator thing, right? I mean, you think about when Clemson was at its best, they had the co-coordinators with Tony Elliott. And so, I mean, it's been successful in spurts, right? It has.
Right. Well, it's all about what's the structure that you have. Right, because to your point about LSU, technically Steve Ensminger was the offensive coordinator that year, and basically he would call the plays, and Joe Brady would basically design the game plan, and then Steve Ensminger would call it, and Joe Brady would have a big say on what was called. But as you said, I think Clemson did it as good as anybody's done it, in my opinion. Washington this year, we always talk about Ryan Grubb being the offensive coordinator, but Jacoby Shepard was the pass game coordinator and had a big say in things. Kalen DeBoer had a big say in it. So I think a co-coordinator situation could work if it's the right guys, but there'd have to be some buy-in. And, like Tony Elliott and Jeff Scott had been at Clemson for a little bit together. So there was a relationship there. So it would be interesting to see how it would go, but that's something to consider if maybe one of the top guys come. Like, we'll mention a couple guys here in a minute that are veteran guys. You're not bringing them in to be co-coordinators. They're not leaving their jobs as current OCs at the Power 5 level or current head coaches at the Division I level to become a co-coordinator. That's just the reality of it. Next candidate, Ryan, I want to talk about is Joe Brady. So this is not just throwing him out there because he was at LSU thing. This is a name that I think is worth discussing for a number of different reasons, and someone who I've heard enough from enough people that he's at least someone I expect to be for Notre Dame to reach out to. I do know that Marcus Freeman does have a past relationship, not a working relationship, or like they work together anywhere, but they know each other. And so he is a guy that I do expect Notre Dame to take a look at. Obviously, Joe Brady is the current quarterbacks coach for the Buffalo Bills. He was the pass game coordinator, receivers coach for the LSU team in 2019. Had a lot to do with the quarterbacks. Before that, he was with Sean Payton for 2 years with the New Orleans Saints. He was at Penn State in 2015 and 2016. So, he's a guy that is a very interesting guy to discuss, Ryan. And we all know the reason he's on this list primarily, right? It's because of the success they had in 2 years or in his 1 year there at LSU, right? Where they won a national championship. So he's going to be a guy that people are going to talk about, but there's a reason for it. And some of the names being thrown around are just like, dude, that's pie in the sky stuff. Like, that's kind of how David Shaw is. David Shaw is just a guy whose name gets brought up, and we respect his offensive mind a lot. And so we say, hey, if he wants him, but we're trying to be more serious with this, and guys we think are actually could be legitimate candidates if Notre Dame pursued them and to find some guys with connections. So I do think Joe Brady is a name to keep an eye on. Again, right now, there is no one guy, but if Joe Brady was willing to come back to college, I think he'd be a guy that Notre Dame would want to have a conversation with. But that right there is the question mark right now, Ryan, is does he want to come back to college?
I mean, obviously it's a massive question mark, right? I mean, we're talking about a guy that literally has been in the NFL since 2019, right? It's not like, he's showed an interest to go back.
And was there the 2 years before 2019. Right. Sorry, Ryan. But yeah, and was there the 2 years before 2019
Now, that was actually a perfect interruption, Brian, because I coughed. So it was fantastic. That. Good job on you, man.
Yes.
Yes. You're like telepathic. It was fantastic.
Well, it's just I interrupt you so much. It was bound to be at a perfect time, right? It's just law of averages.
That was the best interruption that you've ever had. But
yes, thank you.
He's a really interesting coach, though, because like I said earlier on our previous podcast, 2019 was just such a fantastic job on his part, right? And you mentioned, obviously, the implication. The passing game was really where he was so influential, bringing some of that New Orleans Saints terminology and just kind of understanding route concepts, all that great stuff. And they went from a pretty average offense in 2018 to maybe the best offense we've ever seen, ever. Not even average, below
they
average.
Were not
offense.
average. Because here's the thing. Here's the thing people have to remember about that year, right? They averaged 32.8 points per game that year, the year before at LSU. And I already pointed out the stats earlier. He had Joe Burrow in his first year as a starter, which was his senior season, had 6 fewer touchdown passes than Drew Pine had a quarterback rating that was 20 points below Drew Pine's, had a completion percentage well below Drew Pine's, and averaged fewer yards per attempt than Drew Pine, with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Stephen Sullivan, Terrace Marshall on that roster. Yep. Everybody comes back the next year and they go from what they were. But here's the other thing to consider about that team that averaged 32.4 points per game. They scored 72 points against Texas A&M in like 7 overtimes. And so even that number is inflated. And so it was really, they were really sub that. And I think if I remember correctly, it was 24-24 at the end of regulation. Yes. Yeah. No, it was 10-17. It was 31-31 at the end of regulation. So if you take away the points that they had from that game and just look at what they had in regulation, LSU that year was averaging 29.2 points per game. To be sub 30 at a place like LSU or even Notre Dame is not an average offense. It's a below average offense.
Sure.
And, we talk about, the issues we had with Notre Dame this year and how their offense wasn't great and it should have been better and they had some bad games. And we talk about all the reasons. Fact of the matter is, Ryan, you take away the overtime game and LSU averaged fewer yards per game than Notre Dame did this year. They averaged significantly lower yards per play. Notre Dame was at 5.9. They were at 5.5, which is almost a half yard, which is a big difference in college football. So even with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Terrace Marshall, and the offensive linemen that they had on that football team. What's that?
Yeah. Thaddeus Moss, too, I think.
Right.
There. Yeah.
Even with the guys on that football team, Ryan, they were still a sub 30 point per game offense. The next year, they come out and they average 48.4 points per game. They scored 37 points in the SEC title game against Georgia. They scored 63 points in the playoff game against Oklahoma. And they scored 42 points against Clemson.
And by the way, that game against Oklahoma could have been a lot worse. They pulled Joe Burrow in that second half pretty early.
Didn't they have like 49 at halftime?
Something like that.
It was like 49 or 56. Yes.
I think he had 6 or 7 touchdowns at halftime. It was wild.
In the first half. It was absolutely insane. And so you're talking about an offense that went from, you talk about the leaps that they made in that second year. They went from, I already told you how bad their offense was, 402.1 yards per game, 5.5 yards per play. They jumped up to 568.4 yards per game and 7.9 yards per play. They went up 2.5 yards per play in one season with the same players.
It's wild.
And, but look, you always knew the talent was there. And I've said this before. That's the reason I had LSU as a playoff team that year. I predicted them because you knew the talent. You could watch them play in 2018 and you could see the talent. And you're like, dude, they're wasting this talent. They're absolutely wasting this talent. And then when you hear that they're bringing in an NFL guy I didn't know Joe Brady from Adam, but a guy that had worked with Sean Payton for 2 years. He was in the NFL. He's going to spruce up the offense and make it more modern. You're like, okay, it doesn't take that big of a leap for them to be a playoff team. And then he made it unreal, and just all worldly. And part of it was all the stars aligned, right? Like he didn't turn Joe Burrow into an elite quarterback. He unleashed Joe Burrow. That's, you know what I mean? Like Joe Burrow's not a guy that didn't have talent and he turned him into a great talent. He's a guy that said, this guy's got great ability. Let's maximize it. He didn't take the receivers and turn Jamar Chase into a star. He unleashed Jamar Chase. He unleashed Justin Jefferson. And that's what we're looking for someone to do at Notre Dame. You've got Audric Estime and Logan Diggs and unleash Chris Tyree, unleash Deion Colsey, unleash Tobias Merriweather in this unit, right? The talent's there. Learn how to use it. And that's what Joe Brady did at LSU. Now, would he come to Notre Dame and they're going to score 48.4 points per game next year? I don't think so. Because, again, you don't have Joe Burrow at quarterback. You don't have Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson at wide receiver. You're going to have a better offensive line and a deeper backfield, in my opinion. And I think better talent at tight end. But the difference at quarterback and receiver is pretty enormous. But
sure,
you do have a veteran quarterback that can absorb a lot of information. And the one thing, we said this in an earlier show, the one thing I loved about what LSU did, Ryan, it was a far more complex system for the quarterback than it was for the receivers.
Yeah.
And that's important. And so you're going to run different concepts. He was a spread you out, find isolations kind of guy. They didn't run the ball a ton, but they were good at running the ball that year. That would obviously need to change. It'd have to be a little bit more effective. They were at 166.8, average 4.9 yards per carry, but they weren't a very good rushing team the year before. They did jump on about 9 yards per carry that second year. They weren't quite as good at throwing it, but look, 166.8 yards per game with an offense that was throwing for like 400 a game. It's pretty good, actually. Because they averaged 401.6 yards per game and still ran for 166 yards per game. Yeah. So to me, I think you look at it, it would be a relatively smooth transition if Joe Brady wanted to take that look. And he would walk into a situation with a pretty experienced group of players that I think could pick up the stuff he likes to do pretty quickly. And that's what helped him at LSU. He had his coach's kid playing quarterback who was going to be a fifth-year senior that could absorb that information. Sam Hartman can do that. Tyler Buckner going into his junior year can do that. And then, of course, you're bringing in two huge high IQ guys in Kenny Minchey and CJ Carr that would be able to fit that as well. So Joe Brady, to me, is a guy that certainly would be a candidate that I think Notre Dame will look at and Notre Dame should look at. The question goes back to what we said, Ryan. Is Joe Brady interested in coming back to college? And that's the big question mark.
It is, because I feel like some people are going to – I feel like most people would be really excited about it from a fan base perspective, but some people would look at it and be like, well, he wasn't very good in Carolina. But I think when you just kind of look at that situation, you're going to be like, First year you have Teddy Bridgewater, who we know has his limitations, right? Christian McCaffrey only played a couple games because of injury. And then the next year, he's saddled with Sam Darnold. Christian McCaffrey gets hurt again.
Sure.
And then he's the scapegoat. And then we see Matt Rule this year. It's the same story, right? So it was actually
if not worse
as much.
Right.
Yes, if not worse.
Well, and the thing too is, Ryan, the NFL and college football are different animals. I mean, we've seen this before. We've seen Harry Hiestand got fired from the Bears, right? It's a completely different animal, and assistant coaches are often scapegoats for head coaches. I mean, that's why Harry Hiestand got fired, right? So, yeah, it's a different animal.
It is 100%. And I would say this, the one thing that I really do like about Joe Brady is that he's still only 33 years old. Like, I feel like we've known his name for a long time now. He's 33 years old. He's been around Sean Payton, like we talked about. He's been around a really good coaching staff in Buffalo under Ken Dorsey, obviously at offensive coordinator this year. He's been around some really smart offensive guys. And I feel like sometimes that adversity that he hits in Carolina makes a coach better, right? Like, you understand things when adversity hits, I think, a little bit more. He was still a young guy. I mean, he was only 30, 31 years old. So he's a person that's been around a lot of great people, and he has shown that the injection that he can have into an offense can really take them next level. We have seen that. So, I mean, he would be an exciting he's an exciting candidate for Notre Dame potentially, because he brings a lot of pro elements, but he also brings a lot of understanding of how to utilize players to the best of their ability. And I think that you saw that with the jump that Clyde Edwards-Helaire had in his final year at LSU, with how Jamar Chase obviously took a big step. Thaddeus Moss was a really, productive football player that final year. I think that you've seen that he can really alter his perspective to make players fit into their role really well too as well. So I think I like that a lot.
Well, Ryan, one thing is for sure, it would be the biggest splash hire that Notre Dame could make. I mean, whether it's the best hire or whatever, we're not making that judgment because like, honestly, I don't think there's a best hire. I think there's several guys that could come here and do a phenomenal job. And we're going to talk about all those guys in the show tonight. So I'm not one of those people that believes there's only one hire and anyone other than that is just not good enough. I'm not someone that believes that, Ryan. But I do believe, however, that there are certain batch of hires that if you can get someone from this group, you feel very good about where you stand. But I think we can say without question that Joe Brady would be the biggest splash hire. It would be the hire that would send the biggest ripple effects through college football, and certainly from a recruiting standpoint. And that's the thing is, I've heard he doesn't like to recruit, but to a degree, doesn't have to work as hard as Tommy Rees did at recruiting. Because it's just like, if you're a receiver, why would you not want to play in that offense? If you're a quarterback, why would you not want to play in that offense? And that's kind of the thing is like the recruiting comes, it's like with Harry Hiestand, becomes a little bit simpler. Other coaches on the staff will get fired if they try to recruit the same way that Harry Hiestand does, which is just pick your guys and go get them and call it a day. But Harry can do that. Other coaches can't. And that's the part of it.
Isn't it such an easy sell to be like, hey, guys, I'm Joe Brady. Nice to meet you. Last time I was in college, I helped Joe Burrow become the best quarterback that we have maybe seen in the last X amount of years in college football. Oh, by the way, you know Justin Jefferson, dude, who is the best receiver in the NFL probably right now? Or that Jamar Chase kid that is in Cincinnati that's pretty close to being the best receiver in the NFL? I helped them get there. I did. I was a part of that maturation. I mean, the year before that he got there, not to backtrack again in this conversation, but Justin Jefferson had like 50-something catches for like 800 yards. Like, he was a good football player the year before. But he became one of the best receivers in college football and a first-round pick in large due to what Joe Brady was able to put into that offense, right? Jamar Chase becomes the best receiver in college football. So you want to talk about easy sells, as if Coach Stuckey isn't making as much, as much impact on the wide receivers in the 2023 class and already on the 2024 class. I mean, can you imagine him sitting down with a guy like Ryan Wingo, for instance, and being like, hey, man, do you want to be Jamar Chase? Do you want to be him? Because I know how to get the guy there. I know how to do that. I look at my track record. I helped make that happen. So I think it's a massive upgrade for recruiting. And I mean, Joe Cool was my quarterback, man. Last time I was in college. You want to be Joe Burrow? Do you want to be Joe Burrow? Come be Joe Burrow.
Right. Well, I'll give this last point to you. Here's LSU's points per game in the 3 years before and the 3 years after Joe Burrow. 28.3, 27.2, 32.4. It was really sub 30 because you had the overtime game. That's the 3 years before. 48.4 in his 1 year, dropped down to 32 the next year, 26.5, and this year they were 34.5. Thanks in large part to 65 points against Southern and then a bowl game, so 63 points against Purdue. So you had a couple games that padded those stats a little bit. So certainly would be a splash, big time splash hire, Ryan.
Yep.
Let's go to our next candidate, Mr. Roberts, and our next candidate that we think is definitely a name to keep an eye on if you're Notre Dame fans is Andy Ludwig from Utah, excuse me. Obviously, the last 2 years, Utah has been the Pac-12 champ and a guy that, number one, Ryan, when you talk about what is his scheme, you break down his film, he's a pro-style guy. It would be a relatively seamless transition. There's some concepts he runs that Notre Dame doesn't run. There's a lot of stuff that they run. It's similar to what he does. Running the football-wise, one of the things that we've talked about on the show, actually might have been on the CFB Nation show, but how I love the run game he put together against USC. It's what we were begging for Notre Dame to do. Instead of just running do all day, mix it up inside and outside, keep them off balance. And that's exactly what he did. They ran inside zone, they ran stretch, they ran outside zone, they ran misdirection, they did wildcat runs. They really kept USC off balance in the run game and were really able to punish them in the run game, which then set up a lot of big play action shots that he took. So schematically, Ryan, I think the fit would be pretty seamless for Andy Ludwig, who's on the older side of it, right? But you're talking about a guy you're bringing in to say this guy can get you where you need to go, like now, in my opinion.
Well, and he's a guy. I mean, I love that you started with the run game stuff for a second, right? Because we have had the one big thing, the one big negative that we were talking about during the season, and that Notre Dame fans were kind of inkling, is that like, you wanted Tommy Rees to be more diverse with how he uses his running backs because they're different, right?
That was our biggest complaint. And then they would just do duo over and over and over and over, right?
Andy Ludwig, this past 2 years, has had 3 completely different types of running backs, right? You have Tavion Thomas, who is a hammer, 240 pounds. You have Jaquin Johnson, who is a former Texas quarterback that's like a 6'2", 225-pound kind of glider. And then you got Micah Bernard, who's kind of the twitchy dude, right? A little bit of a smaller back. And you saw it. I mean, inside zone, outside zone, some power concepts. They really do mix it up a ton. And the thing that I really like about it as well is, I mean, he's averaged over 38 points a game in back-to-back years. And I would argue that he doesn't really have a ton of talent to work on.
No.
I mean, Tavion Thomas is going to be in a camp this year for the NFL. I don't know if he's going to get drafted, though. Micah Bernard is a good college player. Jaquin Johnson is a good college player. I don't know if those are NFL players, though.
Right.
They have Dalton Kincaid, who's an NFL player, Brant Keithy, who's a pretty good college tight ends. They have a bunch of solid college receivers, and then they have Cameron Rising, who I would say is not incredibly talented, but you've gotten a lot out of Cameron Rising the last 2 years. Yeah, good college quarterback.
You're going to have 3 quarterbacks, I'd argue 4 quarterbacks on your roster with better arms than Cameron Rising.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what I would say.
So if I look at them and say, if I look at this offense that Utah's had over the last couple of years, and I say, Andy Ludwig got that out of that offense with the talent that he had, I mean, I would think that a guy like him would be licking his chops to want to work with some of the talent that Notre Dame has, right? So he's a person for me that I think is diverse with how he attacks. He runs the football at a high rate, over 216 yards, I think, each of the last 2 years per game. And he is a person that also understands that there's different style you need to play in certain situations. Like you mentioned the USC game where it's like, we need to play this style to slow this team down a little bit, right? We need to get down and dirty.
Well,
we need to run the football.
And he recognized what they're not good at.
Exactly.
And he went right at it. He took advantage of it. And it wasn't just, we're going to do what we do. It's, here's where they're not good, and we're going to use what we do well to exploit it. And, you talk about one of the criteria was there has to be a seamless transition. Yep. And to me, the transition there is he might have the most easy transition into Notre Dame's offense because he likes to mix up his personnel, but he likes to use a lot of 12 personnel. And Notre Dame's got a system that can do that. He likes to throw to the tight ends a decent amount. Part of that is because they don't have great receivers. Their most talented players were their tight ends the last couple of years. But in other years, a little bit more receiver oriented when they've had better receivers, which they just don't have great receivers right now, to be completely honest with you. So that's why they did use the tight ends a lot more in recent seasons. So, I think he'll adapt to what they do based on the personnel, but that personnel fits what Notre Dame does very well. And when, it doesn't matter who they've had at running back, they get production in the run game every year. He understands being balanced, and you start giving him better weapons in the pass game, then guess what? He's gonna throw the ball more effectively and more efficiently. And here's the other thing I like too, Ryan, is they're a very efficient offense, despite having a quarterback who honestly isn't the most accurate guy in the world, to be completely honest with you, in Cameron Rising. So he's a gamer, he's gutsy, he's gritty, but he's not a super talented guy, which is why he's still in college football, in my opinion, and not off to the NFL. So I think Andy Ludwig would make a lot of sense. And I think scheme-wise offensively, run game also, there's a lot of carryover. He would fit in very well with what Notre Dame does. Because like the duo emphasis that Notre Dame was this year, I mean, I'm sure Harry Heastan likes duo as well, loves duo. But that was a Tommy Rees thing more so. When Harry was here the last time, they were inside-outside zone, G-scheme, buck sweep, counter type of offense. So Harry Heastan can coach whatever the heck you need him to coach. Right. But I think we see a lot of zone stuff that Heastan used to do a lot of which is why he was brought to Notre Dame. That's what Brian Kelly brought him. They wanted to go away from being a pin and pull team to more of an inside zone, outside zone type of team. And that's what Andy Ludwig would do a lot of. Play action, mixing up the different. I mean, he's had different backs. I mean, went from Zach Moss, who was a monster under him.
Monster.
I mean, he'll build around the person. I think that's one thing he's shown at Utah, Ryan, is he'll build around his personnel relatively well, in my opinion.
I mean, you mentioned Zach Moss. I'll mention Tavion Thomas, and they're kind of cut from a similar cloth as far as being bigger backs, physical. And I think that that's the thing for me, is that you look at what Notre Dame has and talk about the seamless transition. If he can get that much out of, and Zach Moss was a 3rd-round draft pick, so I'm not going to act like he's not talented, right? Zach Moss was a talented football player. But if you get as much as you did out of Tavion Thomas over the last 2 years, you don't think Andy Ludwig looks at Audric Estime like, I could do that, man. Like, that's the type that I've been doing well with. Talk about Micah Bernard is kind of that, outside-oriented slasher type. Get him in space a little bit. Well, You have Chris Tyree in the backfield, right? The one thing that they did have at receiver, they weren't incredibly talented there, but they had a couple pretty tall dudes outside. Number 17, I think, was like 6'4"-ish. Like, he's a tall dude. They had some success with him, especially in the bowl game. Cameron Rising, I think, is stylistically pretty similar to Sam Hartman. I think Sam Hartman is considerably more talented, in my opinion. But they are similar-ish football players, right? So I think that you look at what he did at Utah and you juxtapose that to what Notre Dame has. I feel like, if anything, it's similar, except it's supercharged at Notre Dame, which I think gets you really excited, obviously.
A lot of the stuff that we kind of wanted Tommy Rees to run a lot more of, he does at Utah. Now, he's the one coach on here that I have not seen a ton of RPO from, but he has some. He has some. And I think that would be something that you could potentially adopt with kind of who you are and what you're trying to bring. And here's the other thing too, Ryan, here's my test. My test is, what do you do relative to what people around you did? And when you look at Utah from the 4 years, because he's been there 4 years, 19 through 22, the 4 years before, Utah started in 15, 30.6 points per game, 29.8, 29.5, 28.1. So from anywhere from 28.1 to 30.5 is the best they did. Yards per game, 363 and 5.1 per play. 430.7, 5.8 per play. It's a pretty decent year. 413 and 5.6 and 395 and 5.7. So never over 6 yards a game, which is the minimum where you want to be. Right. In the 4 years with him as the offensive coordinator, they have been, his first year, 32.3 points per game. So already higher. It was the most points they scored. I'm trying to find it. It's the most points they scored since 2010. If you remember, they were in the Mountain West back then. And that was a team that Notre Dame came and played. They came into Notre Dame and scored 3 points. So 32.3, 30.2. That was during the COVID year. If you remember, they only played 5 games. Then they went 36.1 and then 38.6 yards per game, 429 and 6.6 per play. Significant jump in yards per play. Then they were 409.8 and 5.9. That was the COVID year. Then they jumped up. And if you remember the COVID year, the Pac-12 started super late. At first, they weren't going to play that season. Then they decided to play. It was a disaster of a season for the Pac-12.
It was a mess. It was a mess.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when you look at their numbers, that was the anomaly. So then in 2021, 431.5 yards, 6.4 per play. And then in 2022, they were at 466.9 and 6.5 per play. So significant jumps, in my opinion, in yards, not so much yards per game, but yards per play.
Yes.
And that's the big thing for me. It shows a great deal of efficiency. And he did it in all of those years, Ryan, without ever having a big-time quarterback. With all due respect to Cameron Rising, with all due respect to Tyler Huntley. Yeah. And honestly, if you look at Tyler Huntley, who's now a Pro Bowl quarterback in the NFL, which is insane. Is he like the only guy that wanted to be in it?
He threw like 3 touchdowns this year. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
it's like he's the only guy left that would say yes, right?
Exactly.
Tyler Huntley in the year before he showed up, before Andy Ludwig showed up, completed 64.1% of his passes, 7.6 yards per attempt. The number 2 quarterback who also started games that year was a 6.9. And their 2 starting quarterbacks combined for 17 touchdowns and 12 picks. The very next season, Tyler Huntley at quarterback with Andy Ludwig as the coach completed 73.1% of his passes, averaged 10.3 yards per attempt, 19 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. That's a big jump from your quarterback. The other thing is that in 4 years, Utah played for the Pac-12 championship in 3 of those 4 years. Won it twice. The only year they didn't, the COVID year.
Yep.
And so, again, and then here's the thing. Same thing in Wisconsin. He was the offensive coordinator of Wisconsin in 2013 and 14. And in 2012, they averaged 29.6 points per game. And his 2 years there, they jumped up to 34.8 and 34.6 in those 2 seasons. and they had Joel Stavey at quarterback in all 3 of those seasons. So you had the same quarterback in those years, and then they ran the ball a ton. Those teams ran the ball a ton.
Yes,
and then you look at his success at Vanderbilt, and here's one that got me, Ryan, was his success at Vanderbilt. So he takes over Vanderbilt as the offensive coordinator in 2015, and they're a train wreck. So they're 17.2 points per game the year before. His first year they're at 15.2. Then they jumped up to 23, then 24.6. And his last year, Vanderbilt jumped up to 28.5. And they were actually a decent offense that year. If you remember correctly, that was the Vanderbilt team that almost beat Notre Dame in Notre Dame Stadium. And they finished that year. Here's what Vanderbilt did on offense in their last 5 games that year. Scored 45 points at Arkansas, 28 points at Missouri, 36 in a win over Ole Miss, 38 in a win over Tennessee, and then 38 in a bowl loss to Baylor.
That was with Shermer and Jared Pinkney and all those guys, right? They fall off a cliff too.
Yes,
they fall off the cliff the next year.
That was going to be my thing. He takes that job gets him to Utah the very next year with pretty much the same players. You didn't have the quarterback; he wasn't there, but you still had Keyshawn Vaughn. You still had Kalijah Lipscomb. You still had Jared Pinkney. The only thing you lost was your quarterback. And they went out that next year. They got in Riley Neal. Remember him from Ball State, transfers in from Ball State as the quarterback. They dropped down to 16.5 points per game. The next year, they were 14.8, 15.8, and this year they were back up to 24.6. So to your point, they steadily rose every year under him from a team that scored in the teens, and immediately he leaves, and they go back to the teens.
Yeah.
Right. So you got to, and so it happened at Wisconsin. It happened at Vanderbilt. It happened, and they went to a bowl game that year. Vanderbilt went to a bowl game that year, by the way. And then it happened at Utah. Yeah, and it happened to Utah. So you follow patterns, right, Ryan? And to me, that's a tracker of success. And I also love the fact, and this is just my personal bias, I love the fact he coached with Jeff Tedford. I have a great deal of respect for Jeff Tedford as an offensive mind, especially back when Jeff Tedford was coaching. And so that's always one that I look at and say, hey, I like guys that have been able to work with people that know the position, and obviously he had some opportunities to work with him there. So he also was with Urban Meyer's offensive. No, he was the guy it was Urban Meyer's last year at Utah was 2004, right? So he was the guy that he replaced them that next year when Kyle Whittingham came in. And he was able to be there, but I believe he was at Oregon from 2002 to 2004 under Mike Bellotti. And so, again, you're talking about who has he worked with, Ryan? Who has he been groomed under over the years? He's worked with some pretty good coaches, and been a part of some pretty good teams. So, and I think he's really evolved, and his offense does good. And somebody asked what position he coaches. He's coached a bunch of different positions. He's coached quarterbacks. He's coached receivers. He's coached tight ends, but he's predominantly been a quarterbacks coach during his tenure. So that's the Andy Ludwig resume.
I think he is a guy that I would say has a very high floor as a offensive coordinator, right? Like, I think there's a couple guys on this list that, like, you could say maybe have a little more ceiling conversation, right? Possibly if everything works out. But I mean, I really like the possibility of Andy Ludwig. I really do, because I mean, if he could do that with minuscule talent compared to where you are at Notre Dame, you talked about Vanderbilt, you talked about obviously Utah.
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, similar pathway, right?
Limit talented quarterback and receiver. Yeah.
Yes, Joel Stave, you mentioned, who I haven't heard his name in several years, right? But if you could do that with talent that is minuscule compared to what you have at Notre Dame, I mean, you have to like where you are, right? I mean, if the baseline right now is at Notre Dame last year, you averaged 31 points a game, you have to like the fact that, like, every single year, for the most part, Andy Ludwig has improved his offense steadily every single year. Like, it's never been a plateau up. There's never been a downslide. Like, he's always just kept the team moving in the right direction, and it's dependable type of offensive coordinator calling. Like, I really think that he would bring a tremendous baseline potentially if he was the guy that ultimately ended up with the job.
So Andy Ludwig is a candidate that we think Notre Dame should and will take a look at. The next one on the list, Ryan, is an interesting one. This is also someone that I believe is someone that Notre Dame should look at, but also will look at, and that is Joe Moorhead, who is currently the head coach at Akron. And obviously his background, he spent the previous 2 years at Oregon, and he was previously the offensive coordinator at Penn State. And he was before that the head coach at Furman, and they had some really, really good teams at Fordham, up in the Northeast. I said Furman, that's the opposite part of the country. Spent 2 years as the head coach at Mississippi State, and I think the reality is that Joe Moorhead's one of those guys that I've said before. Not everybody that's a good position coach or head or coordinator is a good head coach. And I also think he made a bad choice. I think Mississippi State was a bad fit for him. He's a Northeastern guy going down to Starkville, Mississippi. So I don't think that was necessarily a great decision by him. But I think Joe Moorhead's a guy that you talk about, Ryan. One of the things that we discuss, and this is something that I think is key, is you need to bring in somebody that can help you get to that place now. I think that Joe Moorhead is a guy that runs enough stuff that there's some similarities there. He's coached on the big stage. 2 years ago, he took his team into Columbus and they beat Ohio State. Right now, I didn't love the way that team folded down the stretch in 2021. I think that was more about all the rumblings about Mario Cristobal leaving than it was anything else, because that team basically quit at the end of that season. But Joe Moorhead is a guy that I think will be considered and should be considered. Is he the top candidate? I don't believe that to be true right now, but I definitely think he's someone that Notre Dame will talk to and take a look at and go from there. So I think for me, I don't know if sometimes you want to be a head coach, so you make decisions to be there, and then you're like, yeah, this is probably not a good situation. Akron is an absolute dumpster fire of a program, and it's not going to support the football program. And Notre Dame is a place that could potentially help you kind of get your career path back on track. So, and he had a lot of interest in the job in 2019 when they fired Chip Long. He had a lot of interest, and honestly, would have taken it if he would have been treated correctly. I'll just give a little backstory now. Brian Kelly interviewed him basically over the phone while on vacation in Florida. And what I was told by several sources that Brian Kelly just kept putting qualifiers on him taking the job that basically made it to where there was no way Joe Moorhead was going to be able to take that job. Right? He basically set it up to where we all knew who he wanted to hire. It was Tommy Rees. And he basically made it to where, well, Joe doesn't want the job. If Joe Moorhead would have been treated correctly and been pursued like someone you value, Joe Moorhead would have taken that job. I know a lot of people that know Coach Moorhead, and that's a job he wanted. So I think the Notre Dame job is one of the few that he would consider not being a head coach anymore to at least look at. I'm not saying he would take it. I think he'd at least look at it, Ryan. So I think that part about it is very intriguing. The question that I have is what kind of offense is he going to, what kind of success is he going to have offensively? Because, I'll just let you kind of give your thoughts on it first, Ryan, before I kind of dive too much into that part of the conversation.
Well, the one thing I really do like about Joe Moorhead a lot is he's developed a reputation as kind of I hate the term quarterback whisperer, but like he has done a nice job developing the quarterback position. He's a quarterback friendly type of guy. I mean, you think about some of the quarterbacks that he's been able to work with over the years. And for the most part, guys have have kind of trended in a great direction, right? So I think that he is a guy that there's a lot of pro style elements. I mean, you think about a couple of the places he's done, and he does have some diversity to him as far as some offensive structures that he does like to run, but there is a lot of pro style principles. But the thing I do like, Brian, is that, I mean, again, for the most part, and it's a big sell to me, is that one thing that people constantly talk about is that maybe the quarterback position hasn't been developed as well as it could have been over the last few years, right? And I think Joe Moorhead is a guy that you can count on and say that's probably going to get better, right? Because he has gotten a lot out of the quarterbacks that have been in his system. He has developed guys really well. So I really do like the background that he has working with quarterbacks specifically, because I do think that he does do a lot of key work with the signal callers who kind of really do. I mean, I've only heard positive things that quarterbacks in the past that have worked with him that have had to say about Joe Moorhead. He's a very respected guy in that department.
And there's been years he didn't really have at Mississippi State, he didn't have very good quarterbacks. And again, I think he walked into a bad situation that he shouldn't have walked into. You're trying to run your pro style offense with Nick Fitzgerald. Like, that's not going to go well. Now, Nick Fitzgerald made improvements offensively. I mean, he went from 15 touchdowns and 11 picks and a 117 quarterback rating the year before to 16-6. Now 16-9. Now, a lot of the other stuff wasn't great. But his backup quarterback was Keaton Thompson, who eventually became a tight end / receiver / whatever at Virginia after that. So it wasn't a great situation. But then you look at what he did at Oregon. I thought he did some good things at Oregon. You had the COVID year in his first year, which I think hurt the development and installation of that offense because, out west, like, you couldn't meet, you couldn't do anything together. They had basically canceled spring. They had canceled a lot of fall. And then all of a sudden, oh, by the way, because everyone else is, we have to play football now. And they played like 5 games. And then his second year, he comes out. And again, they were rolling for a while. And I think that team just kind of quit late. Because if you remember in November, you started hearing all those rumors about how Cristobal was going to leave for Miami. And then they just kind of basically faded down the stretch. They went 10-3 with Moorhead there and Cristobal there. Moorhead left before the bowl game. They lost 2 of their last 3 games, and they only scored 17 combined points against Utah. They scored a lot of points before that. Again, beat Ohio State 35-28. Went on the road and had that win. But he was working with Anthony Brown. I think helped turn Anthony Brown into a guy that is a backup quarterback and started a game in the NFL this year. So he hasn't worked with a ton of great quarterbacks. That's the thing is, Ryan, it's not like he's had, like you'll say, well, yeah, he had success there because, look who he had at quarterback. I mean, the best quarterback he's ever coached in college is the kid from Penn State, Trace McSorley. Think about that. The best quarterback he's ever been able to coach in college was Trace McSorley. I mean, I think that speaks volumes about – and here's the thing. He replaced John Donovan at Penn State. In the 2 years before he got hired, Ryan, Penn State averaged 20.6 points per game and 23.2 points per game. In the 2 years under Joe Moorhead, they jumped up immediately that next year to 37.6, and then they were 41.4 the next season. Since then, Penn State's been 33.8, 35.8, 29.8, 25, and this past year, 35.8. Never came again close to the 2 years that they had under Joe Moorhead. Now, it helped. You had this cat there named Saquon Barkley. He's pretty good, right? But the year before, they also had Saquon Barkley, and they were at 23.2 points per game. The year before, they had Tracy McSorley and Christian Hackenberg, and they were 23.6 points per game. Hackenberg goes pro. He's got Tracy McSorley, and in first year, Tracy McSorley has 29 touchdowns, 8 picks, averages 9.3 yards per attempt. In 2017, it was 8.4, so that went down a little bit, but the completion percentage went way up, 28 touchdowns and 10 picks. He has had quarterbacks that can't run. Anthony Brown cannot run, right? He's not a runner. He is a passing quarterback, so they didn't really run a whole lot with Anthony Brown. A little bit, really not much at all. And so actually, no, they ran with Anthony Brown more than they should have, to be completely honest with you. I'm thinking of the kid the year before. But he has had quarterbacks that can run, but he also has had quarterbacks that don't run a lot. And he'll, like you said, he'll adapt to that. With Trace McSorley, he had a guy that could run, so they ran with him. So, but I think he's a guy that doesn't need that. I went back and looked at his Fordham years back when I was looking at him in 2019, and they had years where the quarterback didn't run the ball a whole lot. So I don't think it's something that they need to do, Ryan, in order for his offense to work. But you've got guys on this roster that can do that, can do the things he's asking you to do. So, again, we look for guys that have a proven track record of getting success from the units that they coach and improving it based on what they were in previous seasons. And for the most part, I think he's done that, in my view.
And if you love RPOs, you'll also love him as an offensive coordinator. Because I think especially to that Penn State team, man. And again, it's partly due to the fact that that's a Trace McSorley type of thing, right? Like, he was a guy that could pull it off read, get the ball out of his hand quickly. But I mean, that is something that we have seen historically as far as the ability to get that ball out quick and do the RPO game. I know Anthony Brown that year at Oregon mean, he did a little bit of that. And then it also, I mean, you mentioned Anthony Brown. If you look at Anthony Brown before Joe Moorhead, as far as production-wise, wasn't very good. It wasn't very good. And he got the most out of Anthony Brown. He got the most out of Trace McSorley. So, again, I think he's a really quarterback-friendly offensive coordinator. He has shown that he can get the most out of those guys. There's no doubt.
Yeah, and there's some people talking about what he did at Akron. And again, I think that's a bad way to look at it. He was the head coach at Akron, number one. And Akron is probably one of the worst jobs in America, if we're going to be honest. And there's a lot of things working against them, but you look at it, they had 72.6 yards per game this year and 5.1 yards per play. The year before, they were 339.4. The year before that, 281.2. The year before that, 243.2. The year before that, 294.4. So they did make a big jump this year from what they were before. And then points per game, they were 21.8. That's not good. No one's going to sit there and say that that's good. But if you look at what they were the year before, the previous years, they hadn't been over 20 points a game since 2017 when they were at 22.1. So you did see a jump. You certainly saw a jump. That is a disaster of a program. And again, that's what he did as a head coach. What you do as a head coach is different than what you do as a coordinator. And so, you know, he's not coming there to be a head coach, and to only look at the 1 year in the MAC and ignore what he did in the Big Ten and ignore what he did in hey, let's not forget too. Remember we were talking about this conversation, how everybody talks about how, man, Penn State gives Ohio State a game every year. Well, since 2011, Penn State's only beat Ohio State once. Do you know what that was? That was with Joe Moorhead as your coach. And then the next year, they went to Columbus and lost to Ohio State 39-38 in a game where their defense just kind of got ripped up. They scored 38 points. So you've got a guy that's got a proven track record in 3 games against Ohio State. He's 2-1. Not a lot of people have multiple wins over Ohio State in the last 6-7 years. So you're going to ignore all that to look at what he did in 1 year at Akron, where he inherited one of the worst teams in the country. I don't know if that's necessarily a wise way to look at his resume, in my opinion. It's got to be part of it. You don't ignore anything, but it's got to be. But that's a really misguided way of looking at it.
And I can tell you, in the coaching world, Joe Moorhead is very well respected by everyone, right? Like, and that matters. That matters to me. The people that are as closely associated to the game, that have high respect for the man. I mean, I think that speaks volumes. I really do.
Yeah. Let's go to the next coach that's on the list, Ryan. And I'm trying to look at guys that, as we look at these lists, is also look at guys that have connections to Marcus Freeman. And a guy that we talked about earlier that said probably not for, and I would say the same, it's probably not, but someone that I would at least look at is Mike Denbrock at LSU. Now, there's a couple reasons why I don't think it will work. Number one is Mike Denbrock is making a lot of money at LSU. A lot of money at LSU. Number two, if Mike Denbrock is there, you got to ask yourself, who's the position coach at quarterback? Because it's not Mike Denbrock. Is it Chancey Stuckey? Could it be Jared Parker? Because I do know Marcus Freeman wants to have this thing be one guy. You know what I mean? And that's kind of what I think you're looking for. And I don't know if Coach Denbrock fits that. But if he's clearly the best guy in the conversation, then I think you got to try to find a way to make it work. That's what I think.
Yeah, and I mean, Coach Denbrock's been very successful at basically every stop he's been at, right? I mean, you talk about what he did at Cincinnati. Obviously, that's where his ties to Marcus Freeman is, right? I mean, they did a lot of good things, obviously. This 1 year at LSU, I know it was a very different team than the year before because you got a guy like Jaden Daniels in at quarterback, and there was a lot of transfer portal players that came in. But, I mean, did a nice job, I thought, in year one. I mean, Jaden Daniels, when you look at what he did at Arizona State, for instance, right, Jaden Daniels was a very pedestrian quarterback in the Pac-12. Like, there was talent for sure, but the production just did not match at all. And then in his year this year with Jaden Daniels, I thought he did a lot of good things. I mean, I thought he really got a lot out of, obviously Jaden's a really good runner, but the passing production took a huge step up going from the Pac-12 to the SEC as well, right? So, I mean, Mike Denbrock's obviously a very good offensive coach, and he has been successful, right? He has a track record that you're going to at least consider, right? Like, you're going to make the call. Sure. Again, it doesn't mean that this is the front runner. It doesn't mean that this is the guy that you hone in on. But if you're doing your due diligence, it's hard to ignore that Mike Denbrock is a very good offensive coach.
The other thing, too, is they made a big jump offensively from last year to go from 26-ish points a game to 34.5. And they had a terrible defense this year. So they had to do that without much of a defense. And then the other thing you look at, too, Ryan, is, big jump in production, 368.5 yards per game, 5.4 per play. You jumped up to 453 per game and 6.4 per play with basically a completely overhauled roster. And, here's the knock on Mike Denbrock. If you're looking at his year at LSU, very quarterback-heavy offense. Not a ton of production from the running back. Y'all, Mike Denbrock was their offensive coordinator at Notre Dame in 2015. We know he got 1,000 yards from a converted wide receiver. Okay? Like, we know the run game's going to be there, right? If he were to be that guy. So I'm not worried about that. He's a great recruiter. He's one of the best men I've ever met in the coaching profession. As a human being, he's one of the best people you'll ever meet. So I think all those things fit. I think he's more of a Midwestern guy in his style. So there's a lot of things that fit, in my opinion, about that job. And he did all that with, as we mentioned, a really overhauled roster. And goes to Cincinnati. And what does he do during his tenure at Cincinnati? He's part of a team that goes and makes the college football playoff. Right? So, I mean, Mike Denbrock's done some really good things. He's done some really good things. Their Cincinnati offense, to me, was not one that was ever super dynamic. His first year there, they're taking over a team. So the year before Mike Denbrock got to Cincinnati, they averaged 19.3 points per game. His first year, they jumped up to 20.9, then 34.9, then 29.6, 37.5, and 36.9. So, again, they weren't like 40 points a game like some of these other AAC teams. But, again, he inherited a team that was scoring 17 points a game, and he had doubled it within 3 or 4 years, right? And you've got him playing in the national in the college football playoff. So I think those are things that you look at, Ryan, and you say, give me that kind of jump. Give me a guy that knows how to kind of win here at Notre Dame, how to build offenses there. There's a lot of things to like. It's just the big drawback is, can you afford it? Number one. And number two, can you make it work staff-wise? I think those are the questions that I have, Ryan. I don't know the answers, and I don't know if you can make it work that way. But if you can figure out a way to make it work, that's a guy that you'd have to give a long look at. And he coached with Marcus Freeman for several years. There's respect there. There's a relationship there. I know that Marcus Freeman thinks very highly of Mike Denbrock. I know that Mike Denbrock thinks very highly of Marcus Freeman. Is it enough for you to overcome the salary demand and to make the staff part work? That I don't know. But to me, and that's what we talked about earlier, Ryan, I don't know if you can make that part work. And that's why I don't think he, at the end of the day, he'd be the choice. But if you can figure out a way to make that work, make the staff work, I think I'd be totally on board with that as one of the potential hires for me. What say you, Mr. Roberts?
I would say the two things also to add in to Denbrock that are intriguing is we always talk about the challenges of recruiting at Notre Dame. You already mentioned that he's a really good recruiter. He also knows how to recruit at Notre Dame, right? Like, obviously, from his past experience. And I would also say this, from his time at Cincinnati, he was very well-balanced offensive coordinator, in my opinion, at Cincinnati. I mean, I think of his best team, with Jerome Ford, who was a fantastic running back. But, hey, he also had Desmond Ridder. He also had Alec Pierce. He also utilized the tight end position of Josh Wiley and Leonard Taylor as well. So I think that he is a very balanced approach where you look at him and say he understands that he needs, you get everybody involved. I mean, even this year at LSU, like I mentioned, Jaden Daniels, I don't think he had great running backs. I mean, the Emory kid has just always been hurt or suspended or whatever. I mean, Josh Williams, I think, may have been their leading rusher this year, who's just like kind of fine. Like he's nothing special. But he had Malik Neighbors, who's a really talented player, who I think that he really had a breakout season, obviously, this year. You saw down the stretch of the season that they had Jason Taylor's son at tight end that made some plays down the stretch as well. So I think he's shown that he knows how to get a lot out of an offense and to also feature several different aspects of his offense. So I do like the balance, and I do like the fact that he knows how to recruit at Notre Dame, because he's literally recruited at Notre Dame. There's no experience like actually doing it at Notre Dame. So I think that there's a lot of positive. Again, I'm not saying that he would be my top choice, but he's be a guy that I definitely do my due diligence with, because he has that reputation. He has done it, and he's done a very good job at the multiple spots he's been at.
To me, Ryan, the group of guys we've talked about so far, I don't have a list of this is my 1, this is my 2, this is my 3. It's a group of guys that I say, get someone from that group and I'm let's roll, right?
Yes.
And that's what the list we just went over is. Whether it's Joe Brady or Andy Ludwig or Joe Moorhead or Mike Denbrock, to me, those are the 4 guys on the list above all others that come with the fewest question marks, but also have the high upside. And to me, that's what I look at with those guys. I mean, you and I could probably do a whole show on how we would rank those 4. And that's not the point. The point is you get one of those 4, and I feel pretty good. Now, there's 4 other guys we're going to talk about before we're going to finish with sort of a, here's a name that you may not be thinking about that maybe you should, and we'll finish off with those. But those 4, to me, above all the others, are guys that I look at and I say, those would all make me very intrigued about what this Notre Dame football team could be. It's not a shock that everywhere Mike Denbrock has been the last decade, those teams win. It's not a surprise. Yep. It's not a surprise that when Brian Kelly took some of the play calling and game planning responsibilities away from him and gave them to Mike Sanford, that the offense took a big step back. Not a surprise. But you also have a guy that has a relationship with Harry Hiestand. And I think if you can somehow find a guy that meets the criteria you're looking for and knows how to work with Harry Hiestand, that's not a bad thing. They did some pretty magical things in 2015 with a bunch of injured dudes, right? Think about it. That dynamic Notre Dame offense in 2015 played almost all but a quarter and a half of the season without their starting quarterback, all but 3 carries without their starting tailback. They lost their starting tight end in the second game of the year, Durham Smythe. 3 big-time players that you lost before the second game of the year was over, and you still went out and had one of the best offenses Notre Dame has ever had, and that offense set the Notre Dame record for yards per play on the season. They averaged 7 yards per play that season, Ryan. That is big time. I mean, that is the kind of dynamic group you're looking for. I mean, this year, there was only 5 teams this year, Ryan, that averaged over 7 yards a play. Notre Dame was a 7.02 that year. In 2015, they were one of 6 teams to average at least 7 yards a play. That number was 6. And let me see here. And 1, 2, 3, only 5. They were one of 5 Power 5 teams averaged over 7 yards per play. The next year, there was only 2 Power 5 teams to average over 7 yards a play. The next year, there was only 5 Power 5 teams to average at least 7 yards a play. The next year, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams averaged 7 yards per play. The next year will be 2019. There was 5. In 2020, there was 5. In 2021, there was only 1 team that averaged over 7 yards a play on offense. Power 5 team, only 3 total. And then this past year, there was 5 teams total. All were Power 5 teams. So I'm putting into context how infrequently teams average 7 yards a play. And that Notre Dame team averaged over 7 yards a play with a converted wide receiver at running back, a backup redshirt freshman quarterback that everybody in Notre Dame fandom said could not play because of how bad he was in the spring game the year before as a redshirt freshman, right? And they did it with their starting tight end getting hurt in the second game of the year, and they had to play the whole year with a true freshman at tight end, and that team did what they did. And they had the worst defensive coordinator in all of college football on the other side of the ball. And that team still went out and did what they did. So, to me, That's one that you look at that I think is okay. That checks all the boxes. So I think those 4 guys to me, Ryan, are guys that I feel good about. If you got one of those 4, I'd feel really good about those guys.
Well, and I would say the last 3 especially, I probably wouldn't throw Joe Brady into to this 4 as far as having a very high floor. Like I look at Joe Moorhead, who's a proven commodity. Andy Ludwig, proven commodity. And Mike Denbrock, proven commodity. I don't think there's a bust factor to any of those guys, right? Like they're going to come in, they're going to do their thing, and you're going to get better. That's how I think about those 3 guys because they have historically told me that that's how that happens. Joe Brady's a little more of a high risk hire a little bit, but he's also a very high reward hire as well. So, but I think that the last 3 that we talked about specifically, I think that those guys bring just a floor and a comfort that you know that your offense is going to be in good hands. You know that you're going to get better, and you know that you're going to constantly improve because those guys have all shown that they have the ability to do that.
Yeah. Somebody just said that in 2005, you had Will Fuller, and that's the reason for it. Number one is they've had big-time receivers before and have never averaged – I mean, that was a program record. The other part, too, is I'll point again, is their top 2 tailbacks that year were a true freshman in Josh Adams and a converted wide receiver. A kid who never played running back before, not even in high school, did CJ Procise ever play running back. And that group went out that year. Those running backs and averaged the 2 starting tailbacks averaged 6.8 yards per rush.
Is that good?
So this wasn't just about Will Fuller, right? This was a lot more than just about Will Fuller. The other thing is, Will Fuller had big time yards per play that year, 20.3. It's a big time player. But their next receiver was 12.4. Their next was 13.0. Their next was 11.3. Their next was 11.9. They were a big play rushing offense that year as well. They averaged 5.6 yards per carry that year as well. That didn't have anything to do with Will Fuller. And so you're correct. When you have a Will Fuller, you're going to be really good. But they finished that year also 8th in yards per attempt in rushing. So, yeah, you've got to look at it. They don't have a Will Fuller coming back. So I'm not saying they're going to average 7 yards a play, but the point that I would make, it's a good point. It's a fair point from, let me see who brought it up, Mike Konashowski, is that's a good point. But the thing is okay, so you take that down 0.3. I would argue that they don't have anybody, like your leading receiver, you take down 0.3 or 4. Let's say your best receiver is 16 next year, Ryan. My counter argument would be, but your numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 pass catchers are also going to be higher than what the 2, 3, 4, and 5 pass catchers were that year. Is that a fair thing to say? Right. Yeah. And so it kind of balances, Mike. So again, it's a very fair point. You got to give proper context. That's why I say, look at the rush game numbers and look at the other receivers compared to what they'll have, because he's right. There's no Will Fuller on this team. There isn't one. But you're going to have a guy that has a really good track record of getting really good offense. And look, even in 2016, as bad as Notre Dame was in 2016, Ryan, their offense wasn't the problem that year. It was their defense. And some of the issues they had on offense had as much to do with Mike Sanford as they had to do with anything. And that was the big issue that I had going into the year. We talked about this all the time is, why are you giving Mike Sanford more say in the offense when your offense was working so well last year? And it created a very odd dynamic. You talk to anybody on the team. Malik Zaires talked about this. You didn't know who to listen to. Sanford's telling you one thing, Denbrock's telling you another thing, and then Brian Kelly's telling you a completely different thing. That was just a dumpster fire every year, and they still averaged over 30 points a game that year. So without losing Will Fuller and Ronnie Stanley and some of those guys. So Mike Denbrock would be in that conversation for me. He would certainly be in that conversation for me. There's 4 other guys we're going to talk a little bit about, Ryan, that I think are very intriguing coaches that I think are, some of these guys are, there's at least 2 coaches on there that I have been told from sources or guys Notre Dame will look at. The other 2 are more guys that I think I'm kind of interested in. One of them that I think could potentially be a candidate for Notre Dame is the head coach at Toledo, Jason Candle. That's the next guy that I want to talk about, Ryan. And he's a former offensive coordinator. He, I believe, was Matt Campbell's offensive coordinator at Toledo, and then he got the head coaching job there. He calls plays for Toledo. And if I remember correctly, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep.
I believe he was also someone that Miami interviewed for the offensive coordinator job last year, and I think he turned it down. If I'm correct on that, he turned it down, decided to stay at Toledo. So he is at least open to the idea of potentially going somewhere, a bigger school, to become a coordinator, which, let's be honest, then would set him up for a head coaching opportunity at a bigger school, because you're not going to hire the Toledo head coach at Michigan or Notre Dame or Alabama. You're just not going to do it, unless he has insane success. PJ Fleck has an undefeated season, goes to Cotton Bowl, and he gets hired where? Minnesota, right? You go 14-0 at Notre Dame and make it the Cotton Bowl, you're getting whatever job you want, NFL, college, whatever, right? So Jason Candle is an intriguing option, right? And here's something that you and I were talking about beforehand that I'd like for you to dive into. He's run very different offenses in his time at Toledo that was geared around what his personnel was good at. And when you explain that to me, because you're a little bit more familiar with that part of his offense than I am, explain that, Ryan, and why that matters, especially to a place like Toledo, but even why it would be good for a place like Notre Dame.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you talk about great offensive coordinators and great coaches in general, you always assimilate to the talent you have, right? Like, that is such a big concept of being a great coach. And I mean, when you think back to like when he was with like Logan Woodside or like somebody in that more mold, they are more passing options than what they currently have in Daquan Finn, who was a little bit more of a runner comparative to what he's typically had. So when you look at what he was able to do, kind of in his earlier years at Toledo and then early on as a head coach there as well, because he's always been the play caller for Toledo. Like, he's always been the main play caller. And you saw some RPOs out of him. You saw a little more pro style system. You saw, some spread elements, but for the most part, he really offers a lot of different looks. And that's what I really like. I mean, there was some 12 personnel thrown in. There was some 11. There were some spread concepts early on in his career. And then he gets to Daquan Finn over the last 2 years, who, has developed into his very good starting quarterback now at Toledo. He is a much more athletic spread quarterback. That's what he is. So you're seeing them almost exclusively in the gun now. You're seeing them with a lot more 10 personnel, some 11 personnel still, and really spreading the football out. I haven't seen personally, of the couple games that I've watched this year, a ton of RPO action, basically what he's doing, but you see a lot more read action, right? Like a lot more read option, ability for him to get out on the edge, that type of stuff. So, I mean, if you're asking for me, like, do I think that he can get the most out of the players that he has? The answer is yes, because he has shown me, despite the style of quarterback and the style of players that he has had, because they also had that Bryant Koback kid at running back over the last couple of years, not this year though, and they were much more of a inside zone, but also some power concepts last year. This year, they didn't have that type of running back anymore. So they really need to put more on Daquan Finn's plate as far as being the main rusher in the offense, being a much more heavily used player. So, I mean, I love that fact, man. Whether you're working with Sam Hartman in 2023 or hopefully Tyler Buckner in 2024, I have confidence that Jason Candle can, fit those guys into what his style is, because I have seen him run multiple offenses, multiple wrinkles of those offenses, multiple philosophies within those offenses as well. So I think he has a lot of variety to what he does. I think he has a very good mind for the game, because that's the one thing we don't talk about enough is, if for an offensive coordinator or a coach in general to do those types of things, you have to be very smart, right? Because you have to understand what you can do, what you can't do, and what you can't push too far. So I really like Jason Candle, man. Underrated guy as far as looking at this job, in my opinion. But I think he's a really smart offensive coach who I wouldn't be surprised if he's got a big-time offensive coordinator job in the future, if it's at Notre Dame or not, in my opinion.
Yeah. Let's look at a couple things about him, Ryan, because I think you make some good points. The offense that they ran with a couple other running backs looked a lot different than the one they had this year, which is kind of what you look at. But he took over as the OC in 2012. He was the offensive coordinator in 12 and 13, then became the assistant head coach in 14 and 15, and then the head coach in 16, and he's always called plays. They had David Fluellen in 2012, rushed for 1,498 yards, and 13 touchdowns. And next year, Fluellen went for 1,121 and 10 touchdowns, 6.7 per carry. The reason Fluellen went down in yards a little bit is because they had a freshman running back that year that ran for 866 yards, 6.3 per carry. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy. I'm going to run this name, but I'm not sure if you've ever heard of him. Kid named Kareem Hunt. You ever heard of him?
Player, man.
Yeah.
Decent player.
The next year as a sophomore, Kareem Hunt goes for 1,631 yards and 16 touchdowns. Their number 2 back, 7.96 per carry. Their number 2 back went for 732 yards, and the number 3 back went for 460. Their lowest yards per carry guy of the top 3 backs was 5.8. Those 3 running backs rushed for 28 touchdowns. The running backs, just those 3. The next year, Kareem Hunt goes for 973, 5.5 per carry, 12 touchdowns. If you remember, only played 9 games that year. He's banged up. The number 2 back, Terry Swanson, had 923 yards and 6.5. So their 2 tailbacks combined rush for almost 1,900 yards a game. The next year, Kareem Hunt is healthy again. He has 1,475 yards. Terry Swanson takes over in 2017. He goes for 1,363 and 14 touchdowns. The number 2 back, 702 yards. The number 3 tailback, 629 yards. Those tailbacks, again, combined for 28 touchdowns. The next year, Bryant Koback is their leading rusher as a true freshman. He goes for 917, but their next 2 running backs both went over 500 yards. 2019, Koback goes for 1,187 and 12 touchdowns. 2021, Koback went for 1,400 yards and 15 touchdowns. In between there, he only rushed for 522 yards and 4 touchdowns in 2020, but they only played 6 games because the MAC had a very shortened season. Yep. He was on pace for over 1,000 yards again. So Brian Koback would have been a 1,000-yard rusher each of his last 3 years. To Ryan's point, they didn't have that kind of tailback this year. They didn't have the same depth. So they had a quarterback that can run. So they took more advantage of Daquan Finn, who rushed for over 600 yards and 9 touchdowns. So to your point, Ryan,
you'll remember to not to cut you off, but he's also a player that Notre Dame saw last year, right? Brian Koback had a long run against them. Daquan Finn had that touchdown, the go-ahead touchdown where Notre Dame had to march back. So you've also seen a little bit of his offense, right? And
to your point, Koback rushed for 114 yards in that game.
Yes.
Yep. So, and they scored 29 points on Notre Dame. 23 points offensively, or 22 points offensively because they had the pick 6.
Sure.
But to your point, I mean, they did move the ball decently on Notre Dame last year. Remember they had that they had a big play early that set up a touchdown. They ran a wheel route, had a really nice kind of downfield pick wheel route concept that KJ Wallace tried to go under it instead of over it, which broke it open. Koback had a 60-something yard run in that game, and then like you said, Daquan Finn had that read zone pull where he got outside and scored that touchdown to put him ahead. Notre Dame, it was a 29-24, put them ahead 29-24, and then Notre Dame obviously went down and scored. So it's certainly a guy to consider. And I don't think the head coaching experience is going to hurt his resume when looking at Marcus Freeman, because Marcus Freeman's been very, very open. I want an offensive coordinator that can come in and take charge. And that's why a lot of the guys that we looked at, other than Joe Brady, a lot of the guys we looked at that we think are going to be top candidates are all older coaches, veteran coaches that have experience. And I think that's a very important thing, in my opinion, for Notre Dame to kind of come in and consider, when you talk about wanting to get a guy that really knows how to take charge of that room. I'm not saying that Tommy Rees didn't. I'm not trying to get into that. I'm just saying that's what he's looking for in this hire. And Jason Candle not only knows how to control an offensive room, but he's been a head football coach. And I think that certainly helps. And he's an Ohio guy. So he's coached in Ohio. I mean, he's only ever coached in Ohio. He played at Mount Union, coached at Mount Union for 7 or 8 years under the greatest. I mean, if we're going to be real about like greatest coach ever, regardless of level, it's Larry Karras. I mean, no one's won championships like Larry Karras, and he comes from that tree. And we're seeing some coaches from that tree have a little bit of success right now. I don't know. Nick Sirianni also played at Mount Union, and coached at Mount Union. He got his coaching career at Mount Union under Larry Karras. So, there's a nice track record. He hired Vince Karras, Larry Karras' son, to be his defensive coordinator. And I thought he's done some nice things there as well with that group. So Jason Campbell's a guy that I would not be surprised if he gets at least some consideration for this position.
Yeah. And he's a really interesting guy, in my opinion, as well, because, I mean, he's done a tremendous job at Toledo. But one thing I'll say from the recruiting side of things, because I have a buddy that is actually, close in that program, right? And we know the difficulties that you can have recruiting at Toledo, obviously, right? For instance, right? Like, you're not going to get the best players in Ohio, obviously. Although it's never going to be how Notre Dame operates as much, they have had to make a really swift adjustment over the last year or so to really going after portal kids. So I just want to kind of put that element out there, because this was something to my knowledge that was Jason Candle's kind of like push real quick, right? It's like, we can't be left in the dust. We need to be proactive with understanding the landscape. So I also think that he has a little bit of that to him, where it's like, not only do I think he's a good play caller and a good offensive coach, I also think he understands that the landscape changes pretty quick. So you kind of have to be very kind of on the forefront and have a little bit of proactiveness in trying to make some of those decisions.
Next guy on the list, Ryan, is a very intriguing name, and this is more of an outside candidate, but I think there might be some interest there from him. But if you're talking about continuity, a big one is Ryan's got to step out for a second here, I guess. But a big name for me actually, I'll talk about a candidate that I want to talk about right now first, a guy that's kind of on my list while Ryan has to step out and before he comes back in, because the next guy we're going to both want to talk about. But a guy that's on my list, and I don't know right now, I don't know that he's on Notre Dame's radar, but it wouldn't surprise me if he does get on their radar somewhat soon, is a guy that Notre Dame went against this year, and that is Andy Roderick from BYU. He's been their offensive coordinator the last 2 years. He's a BYU guy. So, look, some of those guys that are BYU guys, there's a lot of loyalty to that school. I think that there's a lot of I'm trying to think of, excuse me, it's Aaron Roderick. Excuse me. I said Andy, it's Aaron Roderick. But he played at BYU. He got his start at BYU back in 1999. He was a GA there for 3 years, and he's coached in Utah his entire career. He's from Utah. He was at Snow Junior College in Utah, then Southern Utah. Then he was at Utah from 2005 until 2016 as a co-OC at the very end. Then he became went to BYU for a year. He was a pass game coordinator from 18 to 20. And then the last 2 years, he has been their offensive coordinator. So he's a bit of a wild card candidate for me, a guy that I think that they might look at. There are a couple reasons that you look at him, in my opinion, is number one, there's going to be a lot of scheme carryover. He's a guy that to me, Ryan, if you maybe miss on some of your top candidates, when you're putting these lists together as a head coach, you've got to have the guys you really like, and then you've got to have some guys that you're going to pursue. But then you also have to make sure you're keeping a relationship with some of these other guys that if you miss, then you move on to some of these other guys, right? And so to me, I think that's something that I look at and say he'd be one of those guys on my radar. He may not be in that top group of guys, but he's in that next group that I want to talk to because he did some nice things against your defense this year. But he's balanced. I mean, and their offense in 2021 when they had that running back who's he with now? The Falcons now, right? I'm trying to remember his name. Tyler. Algier or whatever, something like that.
Tyler Algier.
He was excellent with BYU. Ran for over 1,600 yards and 13 touchdowns. They didn't have him this year. They still ran for 176.8 yards. Jaron Hall was a little bit banged up this year, but he did some really nice things with Jaron Hall the last couple of years. Jaron Hall this past season had 31 touchdowns and 6 picks. I think two of those picks were against Notre Dame, I think. No, just one of them was against Notre Dame. Notre Dame shut him down pretty good, but he was pretty good most of the year. I mean, even against Oregon, a game that they got beat pretty good, Jaron Hall played really well in that game. They just couldn't stop they couldn't stop Oregon. But he completed 70% of his passes and had over 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. So he's done some nice things, Ryan. A lot of balance, a lot of RPOs, that mixes up personnel really effectively. They'll go 12, 11, 10, a lot of motions, inside, outside zone, and some counter, some stuff that I think would transition really nicely to Notre Dame. So he's a guy that I would look at. The only drawback for me is the guy's literally never coached outside of the state of Utah. So, and I mean, literally, he's a BYU guy that's coached at Southern Utah, and BYU. That's it. But he's at least a guy that I would have on my radar. That's kind of my thing.
He's another guy that's changed a little bit too over the last few years as far as like his offensive kind of I don't want to say style because it's all kind of predicated on the same stuff, but you saw Zach Wilson, obviously what he was able to do for BYU a couple years ago. And that team quietly ran the ball well, and then obviously Tyler Algier took a major step forward, but that team also had some really good tight end plays. So you saw a lot of 12 personnel with Zach Wilson when he was there, the Isaac Rexes of the world, and they did a lot of kind of mixing and matching. This year, I felt like, Isaac Rex has been kind of banged up over the last couple of years. So this year was a little more 11, kind of heavy in deuce. And you did have a couple solid receivers. I mean, Puka Nacua is at the Senior Bowl, right? So like he's had some talent at receiver. There's no
and they
doubt.
had a lot of injuries at receiver this year too, Ryan, which tamped down the numbers a little bit. And their quarterback still threw for 3,000 yards and had a pretty good season. I mean, 32 touchdowns, 7 picks, a 158.49 rating, completed 65.6% of their passes. And that was with 2 of their best receivers missing a big chunk of the year. I mean, Puka played 9 games. Cody Epps only played 8 games. The Romney kid, Gunnar Romney, only played 2 games, and he got hurt again. So they didn't have him a big chunk of the year. That's a kid the year before, Ryan, that had 34 catches for 594 yards, and this year had 5 catches for 59 yards. So I think that was a big part of kind of what factored in. And even with all that, you're talking about a team that went out there and still put up pretty good numbers. A team that still went out there and scored 31 points a game, a team that still went out there, and had 426 yards per play, but 6.7 yards per game. And I think that's something you look at. The last 2 years, BYU has ranked, where were they this year in yards per play? They were 15th this year in yards per play, and they were 8th last year in yards per play. And the year before they were first. That was with Robert Anai, I think was their offensive coordinator that year, if I remember correctly. But that also was a team that played no one. That was the year they couldn't get any Power 5 teams to play them because because of the way the COVID rules. But he was the pass game coordinator for that team. So they're a very efficient offense, Ryan. And that's something I look at. If you'll notice, I'll talk about yards per play or yards per game, just as context. But the number that I zero in on a lot of times is yards per play. That is the one that gives me a better indicator of your efficiency and your explosiveness combination. Yards per play is going to tell me a lot more about that. And the yards per play at BYU the last 2 years, they've been top 15 last 2 years, and that's despite playing a lot of Power 5 football teams the last couple of years, Ryan. And that's something to consider too. I mean, last 2 years, BYU against Power 5 teams. This year, they beat Baylor, lost to Oregon, lost to Notre Dame, beat Stanford, lost to Arkansas. And some of those games were competitive, right? So they went 2-3 against Power 5 this year, played some decent Power 5 teams. And then last year, they beat Arizona, beat Utah, beat Arizona State, lost to Baylor, beat Washington State, beat Virginia, beat USC. So the last 2 years, they've gone 8-4 against Power 5 teams with a roster that's not a Power 5 roster right now. No. So he's done a good job. He's done a good job, in my opinion.
And I think the 2 things that Notre Dame fans would really like about Roderick as well and how he operates is, one, he runs the ball a ton. Like you mentioned, Tyler Algier, obviously, but I mean, Christopher Brooks was a pretty good football player this year. I mean, he ended up getting an all-star game invite. I think he went to like NFLPA Bowl. So he was a pretty solid football player. They really emphasize development on the offensive line, which is awesome, right? But the other big thing is that it's a very quarterback-friendly system, right? Like he makes things pretty easy. You mentioned passing game coordinator with Zach Wilson. Things were pretty easy for Zach Wilson, if we're being honest, right? Like he did a lot of easy reads, play action, RPO stuff, like a lot of easy stuff. And then Jaron Hall. Yeah. Yep. And then Jaron Hall, obviously, there's some easy opportunities for him, right? So I think quarterback friendly and I think running the football. Those 2 things I think is what Roderick wants to do and what he has done over the last couple of years.
I was going to talk about this name, Ryan, but when you stepped away, I was like, well, Ryan's going to want to talk about this guy, and I wasn't sure how long you were going to be. Another name to consider, and this is an interesting one, is Liam Cohen, who's now at Kentucky as the offensive coordinator. I'll just say this. If Notre Dame wanted to make a run at him, I think he would listen. And I'm not saying that because I know him. I'm just saying I just from seeing things I've heard and just that I think he would listen, right?
Yeah.
He's an interesting guy because he was at Kentucky for a year, I believe, correct? Came from the NFL, was at Kentucky for a year, did very well, made Will Levis look like a first-round draft pick according to people, and I don't think he is. Will Levis struggled mightily this year without him. Spent a year under Sean McVay. Things didn't go well, and now he's back in college at Kentucky. Look, we've seen guys take jobs and then get hired a couple months later when a bigger job comes along, and let's be honest, Notre Dame is a much, much better job than Kentucky. And Notre Dame is going to pay more, I would believe, than Kentucky. The reason I mentioned Liam Cohen is, number one, I think he's a guy that Notre Dame would look at and consider as sort of that other group. But here's the other part of it. He is the most seamless scheme transition that Notre Dame would have. I was breaking down Kentucky film a year ago when we were looking at potential candidates when Tommy Rees was looking at leaving. He was a guy that was on our radar. Then, of course, he took the Rams job. He is – it's like you're watching Notre Dame's offense, Ryan. You're watching duo. You're watching that little hitch and then the wide fade from slot that Tommy Rees runs they run that a million times. It's like you're watching Tommy Rees's offense. And why? Because they both kind of patterned themselves as coaches after Sean McVay. And so just from a scheme standpoint, there'd be a very seamless transition there. And Liam Cohen likes to run the football. He's not one of those young, pass it all over the field, don't run it guys. He's a guy that understands balance. But the pass game concepts are almost identical. He doesn't have a very good talent at receiver at Kentucky for the most part. They had like one guy that year that was and he's a 5'8", just throw him
Slot
RPOs
receiver.
And stuff.
Yeah.
Exactly. So they just didn't have a lot on the outside last year, in my opinion. And so you saw an offense that to me, with him, was looked like a good offense despite having a quarterback that I honestly, Ryan, my stance, I don't think very highly of as a great physical tools, but not a great quarterback in Will Levis. I mean, Penn State put him in the game in 2020, Ryan, or 2019, and they wouldn't let him throw the ball.
Walkout quarterback, basically.
That's basically what they turned him into. And now we're people being a first-round pick. So
not a first-round pick. Number 1 overall pick, potentially. So it's just wild, man. But I will say this about Liam Cohen, and I like that you kind of introed it with the McVay style, and it makes sense. I would say this. Some people have this misconception. I just want to kill it right now. Some people think that McVay and Shanahan are like these big, throw the ball over the yard guys. Nah, man, they run the football. They want to run the ball.
Especially Shanahan. Shanahan, yeah.
And I mean, even when Sean McVay's been at his best, it's when he's had a Todd Gurley, right? Where it's like, I'm going to ride that dude, right? And you've seen over the last year with Kentucky before he went over to the Rams. I mean, Chris Rodriguez was his dude, right? Like, I want to run the football with Chris Rodriguez and the Smoke kid, who I think was their backup. I don't know how to say his first name, but they run the ball a ton. And I think that it's very influential for him, although the Rams were not very good this year because of a billion injuries. Like, it was just awful. I mean, the end of the season, it's just like Baker Mayfield's your starting quarterback. And it's right.
And Sean McVay knew what he was getting in Liam Cohen. He coached as an assistant coach with him for 3 years. That's where the connection was. So,
yes.
He knew what he had. He thought highly of him.
Yep. And he's been around a guy like McVay, who everybody in the NFL respects at the highest level, right? Like, he's a very good offensive mind. There's no doubt about it. Liam has shown in his short time as an offensive coordinator with Kentucky, we talked about that 1 year, that he can get the most out of Chris Rodriguez might get drafted, right? I mean, Wan'Dale Robinson got drafted, but we know that there was some smoke and mirrors to that offense. Like, let's be honest about it, right? And I like him. I really do like Liam Cohen. I thought it was a tremendous job by Kentucky to convince him to come back after his 1 year in the NFL. I really think he's a smart, young offensive coordinator that is still figuring out a little bit, but I think that he has implements of, like, you're just like, that's very creative, right? Like passing game stuff, working off of play action. Like, there's some really cool concepts that he's been able to show in his short time as an offensive coordinator. So I like Liam. Again, maybe not the top choice, but a guy that you're just kind of like, that's a really good young offensive coordinator that you need to keep your eye on. You still need to keep your eye on him.
He's definitely a guy that, let's just say hypothetically, you bring a guy in this year. He does great. Next 2 years, Notre Dame's just excellent. Let's say they make a couple playoff runs, even if they don't win a championship, but they're really good, play for a championship, and the guy gets a head coaching job somewhere else or gets an OC job. He's the first call that I make in 2 years to replace that guy. So sometimes he's only 37. He's still a younger guy. The other thing about Liam Cohen, too, is the reason he's in this category, not necessarily the upper category, is because he doesn't have a lot of experience as a coordinator. He's only been a coordinator in college for 1 year. Well, Division I, he was a coordinator, like I think Maine for a couple of years, but like at the Division I level. So to me, that was kind of one of those ones that I take that puts him a step below some of those other guys. can he recruit? That's a bigger question for me. And he doesn't have the rep that Joe Brady has, who maybe he doesn't want to recruit, but he doesn't necessarily need to recruit as well as maybe some other guys. He doesn't have to work as hard at it because of the reputation and some other things like that. But to me, Ryan, I think he's a guy that you keep an eye on. The other part of the reason he's in this category is because he did just get hired in Kentucky, and it would take a lot to get a guy to leave a job he just got hired at a month ago, basically. So that's the other thing is I do think they'll kick the tires a little bit, but I think that'd be a tough pull. You'd have to throw a lot of money at him because that would be a thing I wouldn't feel great about if I was a coach. Like, man, I don't think so, man. Oh, you're going to offer me that much and I get to coach Notre Dame? Well, let me give it a second thought. It'd have to be something like that where, he's making $700,000, and I don't know how much he's making in Kentucky. I could probably look it up while you're talking next, but you'd have to throw a lot of money at him. And at that point in time, like, okay, then are you paying him more than, maybe he's worth? Then you kind of get into that category. And so,
because he is a little bit of a projection, right? Like he's a little bit of a high risk, high reward guy, in my opinion.
He's getting paid $1.7 million by Kentucky. So then you'd have to throw a lot more at him. Because I saw his contract and it says 3 years, $1.7 million. I thought that was what he was making per year. It's 1.7 is what he's getting paid this year. And I'm not throwing enough money at him in that regard to get him here. If I had
good for him, man.
Yeah,
that's not bad.
Yeah.
That's
a lot more money than I'd be comfortable paying him. But he's definitely got to keep an eye on, Ryan. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. Yeah. Last guy in this category, this is a bit of a wild card, and this is a guy that I've chatted with a couple people about today as a name to look at. It's unlikely, but it's at least a name worth considering from what I was told by a couple people, and that's Byron Leftwich. The reason it's unlikely to me is he's an NFL guy.
Yep.
And he's
only ever been an NFL guy. Right.
Only ever been an NFL guy.
Yeah.
I think it's a guy that you'll probably maybe see some phone calls made to, but I don't know how serious it's going to be on either side. But I think it's at least worth mentioning, Ryan. And, I've talked to 4 different people tonight about Byron Leftwich, and I get a different answer from every person. You've talked about, I think your thing, and I think it's very fair, is he's only really ever coached at it from a decision-making standpoint with Bruce Arians, who's an offensive whiz. And the 1 year without Bruce Arians, the offense was terrible. Now, I made a call to a buddy of mine, and a lot of people say that's not on Byron. People that are kind of know about the Bucs program, that's not on him. If you knew the dysfunction that was going on within the Bucs organization, you'd understand. Okay, it is what it is. All I know is the results were what they were without Arians. But he's a guy that I've been told is a really great offensive mind. And another guy that I was told is someone that the players respect, but not because he's a player's coach, because he's just a straight shooter. He's honest with you. He treats you like a grown-up. Would he be like that in college? I don't know. But that's one thing a lot of people respect him in the NFL is as a former player, he treated you the way he wanted to be treated. Respect, talking to you like a man, but also being straight with you. And this is what I think, and this is what I feel. And he's a guy that I was told was respected by the players. Clearly, Bruce Arians thought the world of him.
Yes.
I think this year he was set up to fail, not purposely, but you've got a 73-year-old quarterback. Your starting guard retires. Your starting center gets hurt. You've got a head coach that is not a very good head coach. Wasn't with the Jets, isn't now. But I think that's a guy that you kind of look at. But to me, Ryan, he'd be at the bottom of my list for no other reason than just I don't know what he is without Bruce Arians, and because he's never coached in college. And that would make me very uneasy. Very uneasy.
And look, I try not to hold everything against him this year, right? Because we talked about it on the phone. You lose Ali Marpet, who's one of the best guards in the NFL. Ryan Jensen at center gets hurt. I mean, those are 2 big losses, right? They are. I am usually tentative with the offensive coordinators under the whiz kids, right? And that is what Bruce Arians is. He's one of the best offensive coordinators of this past generation. Like, he's an incredible offensive mind, back to working with Ben Roethlisberger in his younger years with the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Like, he's a really smart offensive guy. And although I do agree with, your other people that you've had conversations with, that it probably isn't all his fault this year. I completely put that in the open. The fact of the matter is that I have never seen him successful without Bruce Arians. And that gives me some pause. It gives me some pause, man.
He's only had 1 year without Bruce Arians.
I know.
So you're absolutely correct. You're not wrong at all. It's just the only point is that but that's what makes it tough, right? Here's what I will say to me is Bruce Arians, from what I'm told, thought the world of him.
Yep.
And like you said, Bruce Arians knows football. And if he's working with Byron Leftwich, clearly he thinks Byron Leftwich knows the game. So, I think you have to look at that. Again, what I don't know, because I don't follow the NFL, I don't know how much say Byron Leftwich had as a play caller when he was the offensive coordinator. If it was Bruce Arians, I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not saying he didn't do all that. I literally don't know. I don't watch the NFL, so I don't know. Right. All I know is I do know Bruce Arians. I do respect Bruce Arians as an offensive mind. He doesn't run the system that I would run personally, and that's a bit of a thing. I think it's not pro style system. It's an NFL system. It is a complex, very detailed, very thorough offense. It's a very pass-oriented offense. Those are more drawbacks for me than necessarily Byron Leftwich not running the ball well or not being good this year. It's that even if he did well this year, I don't think that's a system that translates to college. Kyle Shanahan's offense would translate to college. Sean McVay's offense translates to college because he's doing a more complex version of what a lot of college teams are doing, right? This is an offense that is a John Gruden pro-style, John Gruden meeting, incredibly complex, right? A ton of verbiage and all that kind of stuff. It's just a very complex offense. You'd have to dumb that offense down so much to run a college, Ryan, that I just don't think it's a good fit. But here's what I know though. I know Bruce Arians is a brilliant offensive mind. Bruce Arians is one of the biggest straight shooters in the business.
Yes.
And Bruce Arians thought Byron Leftwich was that guy.
Yep.
And that says something to me. That means something to me since I don't know him. Right. And that means a little more to me than 1 year under Todd Bowles, who I don't have a lot of respect for as a head football coach.
That's fair. That's fair. And I would say that the other big positive to Byron Leftwich is he's a big name, right? I mean, there would be some buzz around the program. It's like, wow, former first-round pick, Tampa Bay Buccaneer offensive coordinator, won a Super Bowl. Like, there'd be a lot of buzz around that conversation. And I would bring it in, and I would be very level-headed and give it a chance, right? Because I don't know exactly, to your point, I don't know what Byron Leftwich is. I think he's good. I'm not sure, though. Like, I just don't know. He's an unknown.
I'll somewhat disagree with that from an NFL standpoint. I do think we know what he is to a degree. We don't know how good he is.
That's fair.
Where I would agree with you is we have no clue what he would be as a college coach. Zero.
Right.
Because he's never done it, and he's in an offense that just doesn't translate to college. You'd have to completely change what he does. Somebody down here, Michael Niebert, says, doesn't zero recruiting experience scare you? And Michael, that's what I mean by when I say has never coached in college. That's my biggest concern. You're going from never having to spend a second recruiting except free agents, when really all that comes down to is, are they going to offer them enough money or not? You're just trying to make them feel comfortable with the system you're going to play in. To now you're going to go to Notre Dame where you have to recruit nonstop for a year. No, I don't think that would go well. And my concern would be, because he is an NFL guy, I don't know how happy Byron Leftwich would be as a college coach, because he would have to kind of dumb things down a little bit to coach college kids. And how hard would he recruit, knowing that if he's going to come here, coach it up for a year, and then go back to the NFL? Well, we're seeing kind of what's happening with the defensive coordinator position, who used to be a college coach, but he'd been out 7 or 8 years, and he's had a really tough adjustment to recruiting in college. And that's someone who has recruited at college for decades before that. But the recruiting business has changed a ton, even since Al Golden left in 15 at Miami, right? It's changed a ton. And now you're going to throw a guy like Byron Leftwich, who's never done it. That's what I mean when I talk about not coaching in college before. That's the biggest thing for me. That, and then the second part is, he'd have to completely change what he does with the Buccaneers to coach at Notre Dame, because it is such a complex system. There's no way college kids could run. I mean, there's not a kid on Notre Dame's roster that was alive when his starting quarterback on the Super Bowl team was playing in college.
Right.
I mean, I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but not really.
Not super hyperbolic. Yeah.
You know,
Right.
I mean, Sam Hartman was maybe a year old. You know what I
Maybe.
mean? Like that's my point. Is like he's a pro. He can absorb anything. Is my point.
Right.
You're now going to go coach college kids? I just don't see it. As smart as he is.
And that's the main point, is because I think that a lot of people would be like, he's probably very relatable to the kids, right? Because he's a younger guy and all that type of stuff. But I would also say, but the only thing he's ever known is NFL football. Does he know how to relate to a 17-year-old? Like, I don't know that. I know he can talk to a 25-year-old, 26-year-old and be a straight shooter with them, but that's a completely different animal from a 17-year-old kid.
Bingo.
Yeah.
That'll get respect from a 40-year-old quarterback, but that could rock an 18-year-old. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like I just don't know how to translate. So I think, I mean, if Bruce Arians thinks Byron Leftwich is wicked smart, then I think he is, because and I think that's the track record, but I don't know if the fit makes a lot of sense.
Right.
I just don't. So
it would be a splash hire. Would be a splash hire if we're being. Yeah.
I mean, him and Joe Brady are probably the two biggest names that Notre Dame could hire. I mean, just because again, they're NFL guys. I mean that's the reality of it. It's just, I don't think that fit makes a lot of sense. And if Joe Brady had done what he did, let's say in 2019, instead of Joe Brady, coming to LSU, Joe Brady would have gone to the Broncos and they would have won a Super Bowl that year and you're going to talk to me about him now. I'd say, no, thanks. Because the guy's never coached in college before. He's never recruited before. Like, it'd be the same thing. It's just, that scares me. We've seen guys come from the NFL to college that have success. Liam Cohen being a perfect example. But Liam Cohen had a background coaching in college before that. He was an OC at the FCS level. He's coached younger kids. He knows how to coach to both levels. Joe Brady, even then, he had spent some time at Penn State and William & Mary, even though he was a kind of a GA. At least he'd spent that. Byron Leftwich has 0 time in college, if I remember. If I'm correct, I'm going to look his resume up right now, Ryan. I think he literally went straight from playing in the NFL to coaching in the NFL. So yes, his last year as a player. So no, he went out of coaching for a little bit, or out of football for a little bit. His last year as a player was 2012, and then he did some other things not football related, and looks like he did some things that, just kind of lived a life a little bit. And then got back into coaching in 2016 with the Cardinals. And like you said, he's only ever really been with Bruce Arians ever since. Right. So, literally 0. The only time he's been in college was as a player at Marshall.
Yep.
That's it.
He was a great player at Marshall.
One of the most memorable plays I've ever seen in my life was the game he was playing in where his leg was busted up. And he'd make a pass, and he'd put his arm, and they would carry him down the field, and then he'd get back under center and make a play. You would talk about a dude that's a man right there, right? Yes. That's a man. But man, I don't know, man. I don't see that. It's like it's the same like in college basketball. You'll see these guys go from the NBA to college, and it's just like they can't teach kids, right? And then you see these great college coaches go to the NBA or go to the NFL, and they're not good. It's a different, even though this is as close as the two levels have ever been in the carryover schematically, it's still light years different than what it is. I mean, even today, Cliff Kingsbury is known as this great offensive mind in college, but I still think is way overplayed. And then goes to the NFL, and guess what? He's not that good of a coach, right? Yep. He's fired already. So I just, it's risky.
I'm just thinking about him hobbling again, man. I remember seeing that Byron Leftwich getting carried, and I was like, that guy's going to be a fantastic NFL player. And then now I look back and I'm like, but he had the longest release probably ever seen in the world. And that probably was why he was good, but yeah.
And he was very immobile.
Yes,
I mean,
couldn't move at all.
Very immobile.
Rocket for an arm, though, man.
Oh my gosh! And you could tell he had a great feel for the game. You could tell he was a smart player, but like you said, very long release, very immobile, and those are the things that really really hurt him in the NFL. and he, obviously couldn't stay healthy either. So
Yep.
that didn't help him either. So that's kind of the 8 guys that we're kind of looking at, Ryan. We have another cat. Actually, that's 9 because we also talked about Jared Parker. There's 2 guys we're going to kind of wrap this up with that I'm going to kind of point to, and it's kind of 2 guys that one guy each of us, we've kind of chosen to say this might not be a candidate that maybe a lot of people think is a good one or know about or think is smart or whatever. They're different for both of us that you have an eye on. So I'm going to let you talk about your guy, and then I'm going to talk about mine, and then we'll wrap this thing up.
Yep. Yeah. So I had Tim Lester, who was the former head coach at Western Michigan, who actually has a little bit of a relationship with Coach Freeman. Obviously, he was on the Purdue staff in 2016. That Jared Parker was also the interim head coach for, after the coaching change that happened there. And Tim is, for me, when I just kind of look at his offenses during his Western Michigan reign, really impressive cat, man, because he was always involved and the play caller throughout his career at Western Michigan. This past year, which led to him being let go by Western Michigan, only averaged 19 points a game because there was a lot of turnover from that roster. You look at Caleb Ellaby was gone from last year, Sky Moore, wide receiver Jalen Hall was a really good player for them who transferred this past offseason. But you look at his previous 3 years, Brian, he was over 32 points per game in each one of them. He averaged over 41 points a game in 2020. That was only 6 games because of the COVID-shortened year, but over 41 points a game. They really developed Caleb Ellaby into one of the better quarterbacks and most underrated quarterbacks in college football over his last 2 years. Was implement with Sky Moore, but he also ran the football a ton. And they didn't have a stud at running back, but he had shown during his career when he had better running backs, he would kind of utilize them a little better. I remember when they had like Jamari Bogan a couple years ago, was a smaller back. They ran the ball a ton more, but he's a guy that, again, I don't know if there's going to be any conversation, but he has a relationship with Coach Freeman. He has a relationship with Jared Parker. And I still think Tim Lester is a really smart offensive mind that I would be surprised if he didn't latch up for an offensive coordinator job somewhere. I don't know if it's going to be as high profile as Notre Dame initially, but I really do like a lot of what Tim Lester brings to the table because he's been a really good offensive coach during his time at Western Michigan and a player that is a coach, I should say, that is familiar with Marcus Freeman and Jared Parker, obviously.
Yeah. I remember as a quarterback, I remember watching him play as a quarterback. He's a good
quarterback, man. He's pretty good.
And he played for a guy that had been at Western for a long time and had some success. And, and again, as we've said, just because you don't ultimately succeed as a head coach doesn't mean you can't be a good position coach or coordinator. So it's an interesting one. It's an interesting one, Ryan, for sure.
And he has the quarterback coaching background, obviously.
Right.
So
that makes it a lot of fit. That makes it obviously a good fit. Makes it a very good fit. So the Jeff Brom tree obviously is interesting to me. He did coach with Brom for a year, correct? No, he was actually let go by Jeff Brom. So that would be the last year of the Darrell Hazel era, correct? Yes. 16 would have been the last year of the Darrell Hazel era. Yes. So he would have been let go by Jeff Brom. So that's the only thing that concerns me a little bit, honestly, Ryan, is the fact that there isn't that sort of who did he groom under kind of thing that some of the other guys have. That's the only thing that concerns me a little bit about him. But I don't know as much about him as you do. But I like the numbers, though. I mean, kind of when you told me like he was going to be the guy you talked about, I said, okay, well, let me look at the numbers. And you're like, I've watched Western Michigan play a few times over the years, and they always had good offenses. I mean, this year they kind of fell off the cliff, right? I mean, but he got hired in 2017. Yeah. He took over. They scored 33.9, 32, 33.1, 41.7 in the COVID year, 32.5, and then this year they fell off to 19. Yeah. So you're kind of like, well, that wasn't the typical deal. I mean, in 2021, his quarterback averaged 9.0 yards per attempt. They were 7.6 the year before that, 8.1 the year before that, 7.2. So there's been a little inconsistency there. And obviously he walked into a decent situation too, because he did inherit the roster that PJ Fleck had built. Yep. So some interesting stuff there. There's definitely some interesting stuff. Here's mine. And this one is there's gonna be people in the chat they love it or they're gonna hate it. But I would definitely reach out to Chip Long. And I understand the reasons why you don't reach out to him. He just got fired at Georgia Tech, right? I mean, along with other coaches. And did some nice things at Tulane, but they had their success after he left, right? I would say I think he deserves a little bit of credit for doing some of the recruiting and the different things that he did to get them there, but, I told him when he got hired at Georgia Tech, like, that's quite a ballsy move, you know what I mean? Because you're going to a coach who's on the hot seat, who I didn't think was going to be successful, and it bit him a little bit. But I think a lot of the stuff that people have said about Chip is just flat out not true. Exaggerations. There were some people that took some of the things that were said about Chip that there was no basis of, that they just ran with and printed. That was untrue or exaggerated. There were some players in Notre Dame that didn't like Chip Long. That's very clear. And not going to debate that. There was also a lot of guys at Notre Dame that liked Chip. I also don't think Chip's the same guy right now that he was then in regards to how he treats people. I think he does understand that there is a time and a place to not always rip a guy. I think he's learned that clearly. But here's the deal, Ryan. They had success with him. I mean, they went 10-3. He was the guy that helped them overturn. We went from 4-8 the year before he got here to 10-3. They went 12-1 the next year and 11-2 the next year with him. And I had this stat earlier, Ryan, too, that I did some research as I was kind of looking this up. But if you just look at offensive points per game, so you take out safeties, you take out special teams returns, and you take out defensive touchdowns, right? So here you go, Ryan. In 3 years under Tommy Rees, the Notre Dame offense averaged 31.9, 32.8, and 30.2 points per game, offensive points per game, for an average of 31.6. In the 3 years with Mike Denbrock, the 3 years before, they averaged 32.2, 32.4, and 30.8 points per game. In Chip Long's 3 years, they averaged 33.2, 30.9. That was the 2019 season. And they were way over 30.9 when they made the quarterback switch. So part of the reason they were wonder is they scored 24 points against Michigan. They scored 24 points against Ball State and 22 points against Vanderbilt. They were much higher after he made the transition to Ian Book. And then 34.9, that was an all-time Notre Dame record in points in the season. Now, that's a bit skewed because they did play more games than past teams, but they were at 34.9. So Chip Long, or Tommy Rees's 3 years, 31.6 offensive points per game. Mike Denbrock's 3 years, they were 31.9. And Chip Long's 3 years, they were at 33.0 points per game. So definitely higher. Yards per play were higher. And Chip runs the football. And he has a relationship with Harry Hiestand. Chip Long hired Chris Watt as his offensive line coach. Why do you think that is?
Yeah.
Why do you think he hired a guy that had never coached as a full-time guy as his offensive coordinator? Why? Because this dude named Harry Hiestand called him up and said, "Hey, Chip, you need to hire Chris Watt as your offensive line coach." And Chip is when Harry Hiestand tells you what to do, you say, "Yes, sir," and you make that hire. There you go, right? And so you've got guys that have worked with him. There's a lot of guys in this offense that Chip recruited. Lorenzo Styles and Deion Colsey committed to Notre Dame when Chip was the offensive coordinator. And I promise you, they didn't commit to Del Alexander, right? Promise you that. So he recruited Tyler Buckner, obviously. He recruited a lot, like I said, Kevin Bauman. He recruited Blake Fisher. He recruited Zeke Carell, Andrew Kristofic, Chris Tyree. So there's a lot of guys on this roster that are going to know Chip from a recruiting or having coached him for a year as well. I know that there would be some blowback. There are some people at Notre Dame that would never want that to happen. I don't care about those people, to be honest with you, because I think those people should be gone, even if you don't bring Chip back. I'm just going to say that right now. But I do know there's also a lot of people at Notre Dame that are part of the football program that would definitely like to see Chip back. Now, if I'm Marcus Freeman, right now what I would do is, if you don't think you can bring Chip back because of all the stuff, here's what I'd at least do. I got several analyst jobs open. Okay? Come back, be an analyst. Let's rebuild your rep. And if my current coordinator does really well and leaves in a couple years, bingo, there you go. Nick Saban has made a killing off of this with former head coaches that have been let go. That's something that I think he should do. Somebody asked if Chip Long can coach quarterbacks. Yes, he can. He coached him at Tulane, and I believe he didn't coach him at Georgia Tech, but he coached him at Georgia Tech. And anyone that was around Notre Dame those 3 years knows that he spent a lot of time working with the quarterbacks at Notre Dame. And that's partly why Ian Book didn't like him, because Ian didn't like to get yelled at. So at the very least, Ryan, I would talk to Chip about coming back as an analyst and maybe rebuilding his reputation that way. If you miss on your first couple guys, I'd feel really good about that. Because I'll say this, I do know this for a fact. People know that I have a relationship with Chip Long. He loved Notre Dame and was crushed when Brian Kelly did what he did. You want to know the real reason? There's 2 reasons why Brian Kelly fired him. And then Brian Kelly sabotaged his character in an attempt to justify firing him. It's 2 reasons. 1, he wanted Tommy Rees to be his offensive coordinator. Plain and simple. Number 2, Chip Long went into his office and said, I want a new offensive line coach. And Brian Kelly said no. And Chip was pissed. So Brian Kelly said, I'm going to choose Jeff Quinn over you. Those are the 2 reasons he got fired. The character assassination, that all came afterwards. Nobody was complaining about how Chip Long treated players before that. Right? There was no rumblings about how awful he was and things like that before that. So to me, he'd be a guy that I'd look at 100%. Would he be my top guy? I think there's certain reasons that would make that maybe a tough sell. But if you could, and I should find out about this, but if you could bring an OC in and then bring Chip in as an analyst to kind of do that, the coach rehabilitation program like Nick Saban does, think about the coaches that Nick Saban's I think Steve Sarkisian was an analyst for him. Mike Loxley was an analyst for him. He's had several analysts that have left to go be position coordinators and head coaches at other places. But they got fired from a place and things didn't work out, but he knew that they had great minds and you bring them in. I think that's something that would go over very well, in my opinion. So I would at least look at that, Ryan. What say you?
I mean, he's a great resource, if nothing else, right? And
he's a great recruiter as well, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. And I personally never had any issue with Chip Long. I like Chip. I really did. Because like you said, he ran the football a ton. And I personally, I know he recruited at a pretty nice level as well, to your point, right? But he knows the challenges that are associated with Notre Dame as well. I talked about that with Den Brock, right? He knows what you need to do to be successful as a recruiter at Notre Dame. He knows what the day in and day out should look like to a degree, right? It's going to look a little different under Coach Freeman. But again, the challenges of being a student athlete at Notre Dame, like he understands what the players are going through as well. So with all that, I mean, in the ideal world, it's probably somebody and then him as an analyst. Like I would love that. If Chip Long was, I would love Chip Long to be involved in some capacity though, because I think he's a tremendous resource. I think he's a really good offensive mind. Yeah. And to your point, it wasn't self-sabotage the first time like people kind of portrayed it as. So,
no, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Was Chip Long always the nicest guy in the world? No, he wasn't. Would Chip Long tell you that, if he could do it over again, would he have toned it down a little bit? Yeah, he would. But the way that they went after him was just, to me, it was pretty disgusting, in my opinion. So that's kind of our list. So Ryan, we're gonna kind of wrap up. We do have some super chats and some questions and some other names that people have brought up that I want to be able to address, kind of during the show. So I do want to get to that. A guy that I've seen people mention before is Gino Guidugli.
Yeah.
So he was the pass game coordinator, I believe, at Cincinnati last year. He is now going to be I believe he is actually at Wisconsin now.
Yes, correct.
I think he went with Luke Fickell there. I've had people talk about him before. He was the OC at Cincinnati this year, pass game coordinator years before. I like what I know of Gino early on, but you'd have to miss on some dudes for a little bit before I'd feel comfortable. I mean, the only reason to really go after Gino is just to screw over, Luke Fickell, and I don't think this is the kind of hire you make to make that point.
He was a guy that I mentioned briefly when we were kind of talking about it yesterday, just because I think that he is and I agree. I think it's a little too early for him. Just there's a lot more experience that he needs to have, but I do think that he is. I mean, he was a good quarterback, right? I think he kind of has that general understanding, and I've only heard really good things as far as him being an intelligent football guy, right? So I think he's just a guy to keep an eye on moving forward. I don't think that he's right for the job right this second because I just don't think he has the experience.
Luke Fickell didn't even hire him as offensive coordinator, Ryan.
It's true.
He was Luke Fickell's offensive coordinator last year. He brought him to Wisconsin, hired somebody else to be the offensive coordinator, and made Geno his pass game coordinator.
We know Luke Fickell is the master of chaos, though. He wanted to just bring the air raid to Wisconsin to see the world burn a little bit.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Freaking Luke Fickell. Another name that a lot of people brought up, Ryan, is Charlie Weiss Jr. There's just so many reasons that doesn't make sense. Number one, he's not the offensive coordinator at OC. Well, let me rephrase. Yeah. He may be the offensive coordinator, but Lane Kiffin's the offensive coordinator and play caller.
And that always worries me, that type of situation. Always worries me.
He's too young. He's too young. This is, as I said before, this is not a learn on the job situation. This is you've got a chance to be really good, and you need someone who has actually done this and can do this. And his offenses at South Florida weren't that great. Now, I've heard Charlie Jr. is a really smart guy. Really smart guy. He's 29 now. I cannot believe he's 29. And he's actually married to and it's just like, I still think of the little kid, 12-year-old kid that was on the sidelines at Notre Dame, you know what I mean? But he's been around the game. I know he's wicked smart, but it's just, number one, if I was him, I would never come back to Notre Dame. Never. The way him and his sister were treated by a small but obnoxious amount of fans, would never want to come back to Notre Dame. And number two, this isn't a learn on the job situation, Ryan. They need someone that can come in and do this right now, and he's not it. He's just not it, man.
Agree.
Sorry.
Agree. Yeah.
He's another guy.
It's just too young, man. It's just too young.
Too young. It's like and not nearly the track record you need. Right. Exactly. Sorry, man. Go ahead, Ryan. I didn't mean to
No. I was just going to say it's the same thing we just talked about with Gino Gadugli, right? It's just like, promising young guy, really smart, but it's not the right time for that conversation, right? It's just not the right time.
Right. Got a super chat from Tommy Guns here. Hear me out. Ken Niumatalolo is available. That is Tommy, and you and I both know this. That's just Tommy trying to get under my skin. You're my dude, Tommy, so I let you get away with it, and your avatar is of your kid wearing a Gap Closer shirt. So how can I get mad at Tommy when that's the
Tommy, that conversation we had on Twitter earlier about being a jerk, that was a jerk comment right there. That was a jerk comment.
Tom even admitted, like, yeah, I know what a good jerk is because I am one. But that's why you're my guy, Tommy. That's why you're my guy. Let Manager One with Super Chat. Thank you. My number one must have for the new OC is that he has a name guys on the board can spell right. That's not going to happen because people will spell. Tommy Rees has one of the easiest names to spell on the planet.
Oh, and they throw E on the end, right?
Yeah. But people do that on purpose. You know what I mean? No. I mean, that's so people are going to screw that up no matter what.
So Gino Gadugli is what you're saying.
No,
got it.
No. Oh God, no. They can't spell Reese correctly. Some people, but I think most people do that on purpose. I really do. I think they do that just to kind of take a shot at Tommy. I really do. Carlton Butler says Tommy will go learn to be a head coach from Saban and come back to coach the Irish after Freeman. #Go Irish. What are your thoughts on that there, Ryan? I have a strong opinion on this. What are your
I don't think the windows make sense, right? I mean, how old is Marcus Freeman? What's he, 37, right? He's 37 years old.
Yeah, 36, 37, yeah.
Tommy Rees is 31. I mean, are we trying to kick Marcus Freeman out by the time he's 42? Like, I mean, I hope he's there a lot longer than that.
I think if I know Carlton, my guess would be that he thinks that in this scenario, Freeman would have a lot of success in like leave for the NFL after winning a title kind of thing. I mean, I'm not. I mean, so I don't know Marcus Freeman's ambitions, but he seems like a college coach to me personally. Like that's just what he seems like to me. I don't know. He likes one of the things I like about Marcus Freeman is, look, he's a smart coach, and all the football stuff is there. But if you know Marcus Freeman, you know he's someone who genuinely cares about developing young men to become successful husbands. And like he said this, and this is true. I was told, he said this publicly, but I was also told this privately. I was told this by somebody I know, that he said that Freeman kind of told all the coaches, like, look, I'm going to bring my kids to practice. And if you want to bring your kids to practice, then hey, let's do this. Because the thing that he said was to his coaches, and the thing that he said in this interview as well publicly, so he said this publicly, but also this privately, is he wants the players. It's not, first of all, it's a chance for him to be around his kids more. Hey, I can't be home all the time, so let the kids come to work so I can see him, right? Let them see daddy in his element. But the other thing was, he wants his players to see how important it is to be a father, to be a husband. And you're doing that not because it's going to help you beat Alabama, but because the biggest goal that he has, yes, you're going to be gauged on winning and losing. Yes, you want to win a championship. But there's nothing that says you can't do that and still take great pride in the kind of young people that you're developing. And I've said this before. Look, I've got a national championship ring, right? I've got multiple conference championship rings. I've been at schools where we set school records that still exist to this day. The most important things that I remember are not the national championship ring and all that. It is having a player that I coach who wasn't even at my position, who told me recently, he's full of crap, by the way, because he's a really smart kid and he's a dentist. But he said that I convinced him in a lunch, like in the cafeteria, to stay in the dental program, even though it's super hard. And he wanted to drop out and just do something different. And now he's a very successful dentist and all these type of things. But he said I don't even remember it, Ryan. I don't remember the conversation. Yeah. But I take so much more pride in that than I do that we were setting records at Duquesne or Christopher Newport or Muhlenberg or wherever else. And that's one of the things I like about Marcus Freeman is, hey, we had success on the field, but my biggest regrets aren't that we lost games. It's I wish I wouldn't have been as hard on that kid. I wish I think that kid might have needed something different. I wish I wouldn't have cussed as much as I did. I wish I wouldn't have screamed as much as I did, because I think I could have made a bit better impact if I would have been different. And those are the things you regret. And the memories you cherish are not the wins. It's one of my receivers at Defiance sitting out on the porch with me, struggling with things he was going with in life, calling me at 2:00 in the morning because he was having a tough time, watching those kids be around myself and my wife because I wanted them to see that being a husband is every bit as important to me as being a football coach. And Marcus Freeman's that way. And I love that about the guy. Absolutely love that about the guy. So that's why I do think he is a college guy, Ryan. I just do. Now, maybe he gets a job somewhere else, but for me, I kind of feel like Tommy Rees's Notre Dame card is kind of pulled a little bit because he left for Alabama. And I'm not mad at him for it at all. I mean, he's got to do what he thinks is best for him, but it's kind of like, bro, you walked away from your alma mater when you had a chance to do something really special because you felt this was best for you. I'm not mad at you about it, but like, you lose the privilege of your Notre Dameness being an advantage for you if a job comes open down the road a little bit for me. And that may be petty, and it may be because I'm a little raw about it now, but that's kind of why I don't see that right now.
And I would also say too, for like the windows matching as well. I mean, we talked, I think we both agreed on it, obviously, that Marcus Freeman is more of a college guy. I would also be surprised if long-term, if Tommy Rees was not in the NFL long-term, right? Like, I think that he's an NFL guy. I think Marcus Freeman's a college guy.
That's why he made the move.
Yeah.
That's why he made the move to Bama, because I think he views that as the best opportunity to get him in the NFL.
Yeah.
And so again, I just, I may feel differently in a year or 2 years, and I got no ill will for Tommy Rees at all. None at all. It's just, hey, look, you made that decision, and sometimes with that comes certain, okay, sure, you're kind of off my list to be the head coach, but I don't think he'd care because I don't think that's his goal, his aspirations. Yeah. Like you said, I think Tommy Rees wants to be, I think he wants to be an NFL coach. I think that's ultimately what he wants to do. All right, let's get to some more here. We've got from Jojo Pineda. Thank you for the super chat, Joe. Guys, I honestly feel Tommy Rees wanted the head coach, and I think Tommy wasn't fully vested in Coach Marcus Freeman. I'm disappointed and wanted Tommy to get us a championship and then go. I will say this, JoJo. I don't think that's necessarily out of bounds from when you look at when Tommy was hired because of the way he was hired. I do think that over time, Coach Freeman and Coach Rees developed a very, very strong relationship. And I can say with pretty good certainty that the reason it took Coach Rees as long as it did to actually make the decision and not just take the job on the spot is because of the respect he has for Coach Freeman. I can say that on pretty good authority. Now, was that necessarily there when he first got hired? I think he always liked Marcus, but he was, they didn't know each other that well. He's a young head coach, and he'd known. So I think over time, they developed a pretty good connection, from what I'm told. So you could maybe say that's true early on, but during the 2022 season, going into the offseason, the grind Coach Rees put into the recruiting and the way he sold recruiting and the way he sold playing for Coach Freeman to recruits, which is the reason I don't think kids are going to leave.
Right.
I think there was a lot of respect there between the two.
And I think that if a guy's not bought in, especially when, the job market is open per se, like let's quantify it like that. I don't think Tommy Rees works as hard to get Sam Hartman in here either, right?
Correct.
Like, he worked his tail off to watch all these quarterbacks, get him to be on board, like all that type of stuff, right?
This and Georgia are the only two jobs he'd have left for, in my opinion.
Yeah.
If Monken would have left 2 weeks ago and Kirby called, and that's it. Because again, what's he wanting to do? If Monken leaves Georgia, where's he going? The NFL as an offensive coordinator.
NFL. Yeah.
Where did he come from? The NFL as an offensive coordinator, right? That's where Coach Rees wants to be. And there's two programs that have shown I can get you there.
Yeah.
Well, really one. But if Monken left, it would be two. And so there was no other rumblings you ever heard Tommy Rees's name mentioned with any other jobs so far this offseason. None. The reason that this one has happened is because it was Alabama and Nick Saban, and it fits Tommy's career goals. So I don't really feel like it's fair to say that he wasn't bought into Coach Freeman, because I mean, to a degree, he wasn't bought in enough to turn down whatever came his way, right?
Sure.
But that doesn't mean he didn't have a lot of respect and wasn't bought into what Coach Freeman was doing. It's just, hey, this opportunity came up for me. And look, I've been there. When I was at Muhlenberg, Ryan, I loved it at Muhlenberg. I was going to go back. I wanted to stay there. And I had already told the coaches I was coming back. I had a girlfriend in town, all of that stuff. But I got offered an opportunity to interview at Duquesne, which is Division III to 1AA. And a team that had won a bunch of games, and it was a great opportunity for me. And so I went to my head coach at the time, Mike Donnelly, said, hey, look, this is what happened. I don't know what I should do. I've given you my word. I want to, and he was like, let me stop you right there. This isn't just some lateral, like this is a chance to go from a Division III school to a 1AA school as a full-time coach at a position that you'd be more comfortable coaching. Because I was coaching running backs in Muhlenberg, and we did pretty good, but I was more comfortable as a quarterbacks receivers guy. And so he kind of gave me that blessing. And even then, it was still hard to take that job when I got offered it. Right. So I went and interviewed, got called the next day, got offered the job the next day. And I still had to think about it because you have that sense of loyalty. And I had to make that move because that's what was best for me in my career path. And so that's part of the deal. And it doesn't mean you don't respect or love the guy you worked for, because nobody taught me more about being a man as a coach and more about, caring for people than Mike Donnelly did in just a year. He was the best head coach I ever worked for. May he rest in peace, because he cared about young people and about football. And it was hard to say no to that, but that's what was going to get me to my career goals. And, so in that regard, I can't fault them for that. I just, so there's no anger or ill will there. If he felt that's what was best for his career to get to where he wants to get to, hey, more power to you. And I don't think we should put like negative, because if there was negative, if he felt that way, JoJo, still, I think you'd have heard his name mentioned with a lot more of the open jobs that were out there.
And I think he may have checked out too. I mean, we've seen some guys that are ready to leave that just check out. I mean,
right.
it happens all the time.
Right.
And until the day he got the offer, like
the day that Nick Saban called is when things changed. Until then, he was full steam ahead on doing what he's got to do at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Robert Slatzer with a super sticker. Thank you, Robert. He also had a question. What about Tony Alford as the co-OC and Corey Dennis as the co-OC quarterbacks?
You probably know a lot more about these guys than I do. So,
well,
yeah.
Tony Alford, obviously, if Tony Alford wanted to come back to Notre Dame and there was a role open, then yes, sign me up. With Corey Dennis, with all due respect, I'm just, again, I've got no disrespect for him. Played DB. He's Urban Meyer's son-in-law. I mean, it's all great, but he has no experience being a coordinator. He's been the quarterback's coach at Ohio State. Do y'all know who the quarterback's coach at Ohio State really is, right? It's Ryan Day.
Yeah.
And so it'd be a learning on the job. Now, Corey Dennis may eventually be a phenomenal coach. I don't know. But he's not ready for this kind of role right now. If Notre Dame was 4-8 and you're rebuilding and you're trying to get a young guy that, hey, we can't get that guy in 4 years if we wait. Okay, sure. Maybe we can talk about it then, but that's just not happening. And I think with Tony Alford, he's a great position coach. I mean, he's in his 50s now. I just think that's kind of who he is. I mean, maybe as a run game coordinator, but I'll tell you this, if Dylan McCullough ever left, I mean, you know who the first call that I would make would be. But I don't know how it fits because Tony Alford's only ever coached 2 positions, Ryan, running back and then a little bit of receiver. So I don't know how that would fit staff-wise because if you're going to bring in 2 guys to be co-coordinators, you definitely got to get rid of at least one coach because you don't have enough open spots. Who are you going to get rid of?
And offensively,
who is Corey Dennis a better coach than on your staff? Like Notre Dame's got at least 2 coaches that would be better suited to be co-coordinators, at least 2 than Corey. Again, that may change in 2-3 years. This is not a knock on Corey Dennis. It's just this guy's been a football coach for 2 years, and he's not ready for that role, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So maybe in a couple years he will be. It's just right now it ain't it. It's just definitely not it. But if Tony Alford ever wanted to come back to Notre Dame, I'd do whatever I have to do to make it happen. He loves Notre Dame, great guy, great coach, all that kind of stuff. But right now, Notre Dame's got a pretty darn good running backs coach also, right? So we'll see. Brock Fonbill says, who do you guys think is at the top of Freeman's board? Also, love you guys. Go Irish. Thank you, Brock. We appreciate that very, very much. I think the guys we mentioned at the beginning are sort of that I think would be guys that would be under strong consideration. So obviously we talked about Jared Parker, Joe Brady, Andy Ludwig, Joe Moorhead, and Mike Denbrock. I mean, look, a lot of those guys have connections to Marcus Freeman. Either they've worked together or they've developed relationships over the years where they know each other. I think all those guys would fall into that category. Yeah, Ryan, I do. And I think Jason Candle, too. He's an Ohio guy. Freeman's an Ohio guy. I know they're very similar age. Candle's a little bit older, but you know they've been on coaches' clinics before. They've been on the recruiting trail together before. One guy's at Toledo, one guy's at Cincinnati. Trust me, they have met each other on the recruiting trail 100 times, right?
Yes.
So
and they matched up just last year.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. So those are the names to me that I think would make the most sense as far as who I think would be at the top of the board for Marcus Freeman are kind of the names we went out over at the very beginning of the show.
And it's Tyler, a really nice. I mean, if that is the realistic, kind of pickings, like that's pretty good board, man. Like I'd be pretty happy with any of those guys, honestly.
There's some guys that weren't on our top 4 list that I'm like, hey, if this guy ends up being the guy, feel pretty good. Now, they may not be the sexy national names that everybody's heard of, but trust me, there's a lot of good football coaches in the list we went over today. Like somebody sent me a list that some guy wrote, and it was like had Paul Chryst number 1 on the list. I'm like, what?
Paul Chryst. I've seen a few people say that. Yeah.
Guys, why did he get fired? His offenses sucked.
Yes.
I mean, you know what I mean?
Couldn't develop a quarterback.
Right. Couldn't recruit. You know, I mean, so no. Yeah, some of the names I've seen are just comical. Here's one, Ryan, that we can kind of dispatch quickly. But I mean, it's understandable why people mention this is a super different Tyler Evans, Dan Mullen. Look, why is there a connection to Dan Mullen? Number one, he's tied to Urban Meyer. Notre Dame fans have that connection. And Dan was a GA at Notre Dame. He's a Northern guy. He's a Pennsylvania guy. It would make a lot of sense from that regard. But I don't see the fit in a lot of ways. I don't see the scheme fit. I don't see the personality fit. I don't see him coming in and playing second fiddle to somebody. He's like, dude, I was in the SEC championship game 2 years ago. I just don't think the fit makes a lot of sense. I think Dan Mullen's going to take a couple of years, hang out and chill, and then a head coaching job's going to come open and he's going to get recycled, which is always what happens.
I also think the emphasis of what you're trying to build from a coaching staff perspective is also just not a fit for Dan Mullen right now, right? Like he's very seasoned, a little bit of an older personality. Like I think who you want to be in position a little bit is a guy that maybe is just a little more like mainstream, like in the Marcus Freeman type of vibe. Like just don't think Dan Mullen fits that. Really don't.
And look, I like Dan Mullen. I've shared this
coach.
before, Ryan. Like when he was at Bowling Green, I spent all seasons with them at spring ball and summer camps. I've mentioned this before. Dan Mullen gave me a lot of great lessons to me as a coach. I've shared the story about how he sat down and he told me a story about, hey, here's something that I would encourage you to do with your players. He said he would remember his quarterback at the time was Josh Harris, right? Wasn't that the kid's name? His Bowling Green quarterback. Yeah. He said, I'll sit there. I'm like, man, I don't feel like coaching today. Man, I don't feel like watching practice, whatever. He's like, Josh, here, you take the remote. You lead him through practice. And the point was, and then he would sit there and kind of correct things. But the point was he needed to know that his quarterback could lead them through film. Because his lesson was if your quarterback can't lead you through a film session, then you have not properly prepared your quarterback to lead the offense on Saturday. It's a great lesson to learn. And I've done that before as a coach. I darn sure did that as a coach at times. I don't feel like coaching today, man. You guys got to do it, right? And they knew what I was doing. You don't actually scare them into thinking you're actually pissed off. But it was just like, man, that's a great lesson. I'd watch him coach. I mean, so Dan Mullen's someone I respect as a coach. This isn't like, oh, Dan Mullen's a back football coach. It's just not a good fit, right? He's not a coordinator anymore. He's a head coach. And he wants to be somewhere as a head coach. And how invested would he be in recruiting, knowing I'm using this job? And I said this earlier in the previous show, Ryan. If you know you're only at a place for a short time and you want to go coach at another Power 5 school and you help Notre Dame recruit, you're only helping them to recruit to be better than you when you get a new job. I mean, whether that's conscious or subconscious, that's going to be on your mind. If you know you're only going to be at a place for a short period of time, you're not going to be as invested on the recruiting trail. You're going to be invested in coaching because you need to have maximum results, but you're not going to be invested on the recruiting trail. That's just human nature. And that's why I just don't think that would fit in a lot of ways. Yeah. And I think he likes the job he has now, to be honest with you. He's making pretty darn good money just talking about football. Be critical of whoever you want to be and say whatever you want. And, if it doesn't work, hey, if I could predict it all right, I'd be in Vegas making millions, so it is what it is. I have a super chat from Reza, my guy. I haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you in the show. How much of a benefit do you think it is that we open with a weak schedule to help break in a new OC versus kicking off with Ohio State like last year? So really, Ryan, you don't really get a tough opponent till game 3. And that's NC State. That'll be Tony Gibson is a darn good defensive coordinator. They're going to throw a lot at you. They lose some really key guys, but they also have a decent number of guys coming back. But they do definitely lose some key guys. They're going to be much better on offense this year with Robert and Brendan Armstrong at quarterback. So, I mean, you got Navy, you've got Tennessee State, then you've got NC State, then you have Central Michigan before Columbus. The team from Columbus comes to town. So I think that benefits Reza. I mean, look, no matter who you hire, there's going to be a little bit of okay, let's get a couple games to work out the kinks. And you've got that. You've got 3 out of your first 4 games are definitely work out the kinks games. And the good thing about NC State is their offense is going through the same thing you're going through, the new coordinator, new quarterback. And you've got better players.
I mean, I think you just saw that with Marcus Freeman when he was the defensive coordinator, as far as that, early adjustment, it matters, right? I mean, and you saw against Florida State, there were some struggles. You saw against Toledo, there was a little bit of struggles, and then you settle in after that. So, Reza, I think it's a great question, and I agree with Brian. I mean, yes, as you're getting the keys to the car and you're making it your own, you have to take it out for a test spin, right? And the test spin early on is going to be Navy and the first couple opponents, obviously, the Tennessee States of the world. And I do think that that's a good opportunity to break in the car, for the lack of a better metaphor, right? And I think that could be a big opportunity, I think, for whoever the next OC is to get a little bit of a trial period and just really test out what he can do, what he can get away with, and just the general flow of a football game.
Yeah. Very good question, Reza. Very good question. Brandon Plensner says, if Joe Moorhead took a substantial salary cut in becoming a head coach at Akron, what would entice him to come to Notre Dame to be an OC again? 2 things. Number 1, Joe Moorhead is a Northeastern guy. He is a Jersey, Pennsylvania guy. And he didn't fit in Starkville and he didn't fit in Eugene. Okay? He'd fit in South Bend a lot better. Number two, sometimes you think a head coaching job is a good gig until you get there and you realize it is a train wreck. Ed Reed learned this the hard way, and he didn't handle it very well. I think Joe Moorhead's a little bit more seasoned. I think he handled it a little better. I don't think Joe Moorhead is necessarily looking to be an offensive coordinator. I think that's why you haven't heard his name mentioned a lot. But I think Notre Dame is different for him, not for every coach, but for him, I think Notre Dame is different. And I think he'd listen. I definitely think he'd listen. Now, would he eventually do it? I don't know. But I think, look, it's like with anything. We just said this with Tommy Rees. Tommy Rees had no intention of leaving Notre Dame. None, from what I was told. Because he's not sitting there thinking like, gee, I think if Nick Saban calls, I'm going to leave. You don't think about that. But then Nick Saban calls and you're like, dude, I'd be nuts not to listen. And then, of course, he made the decision to leave. Agree with it or not, there were just not many jobs he would listen to. And I know for a fact that Tommy turned down a lot of interview attempts. There's been several Notre Dame coaches who have turned down interview attempts because they want to stay because they think they're building something special. He got that one call that he couldn't turn down. Agree with it or not, that's just the way it works. And so, it happened. I think Notre Dame is one of those calls that Joe Moorhead would have a hard time turning down. As far as at least talking. Would that manifest enough to where he'd feel comfortable running the offense? I don't know. But I definitely think it's one where he would say, it's Notre Dame calling? Okay. Let's do this. Because this is just a guess on my part, but I really think there was a time when I really felt like he thought he was going to get the OC job in 19, going into 20, when they fired Chip Long. And I often wonder, like, if he wonders, like, what opportunities would have been there for him had that happened. Because he kind of had to leave Oregon too, Ryan, because everybody knew Cristobal was leaving, and so the pickings were kind of slim at that point in time. So I think that factored into it as well. Aaron Schmidt with a super chat. Aaron, thank you very much for this. Who do you think is the top candidate? Aaron, I don't think there is one, honestly, and that's normally not how it goes at the very beginning. You have a small group of guys that you like, and everyone's going to have things that make you think this, I think, is the guy, but I think this is the guy, but I think this is the guy, but, and then you go through the process of discussing things with them, talking with them off the record. Some of these guys are going to weed it out through some just back channel conversations. Hey man, look, buddy, what would you think about this? Well, I'd think about it, but I'd need this, 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 and this. I don't think that's going to work. Hey man, I love you, but I'm happy where I'm at. All right, cool, man. I appreciate you. And then you move on. Right. And then that's kind of how you will it down. So I don't think there is a top candidate. I think there's a small group of guys that he would look at as, if I could get one of these guys, it's a home run. And that's kind of what Ryan and I were saying with our list is, I may like this guy more and he may like this guy more. But the thing we can both agree on is if you can get a guy from this group, you've made a pretty darn good hire. And I think it even goes past the top four that we talked about, Ryan. I think there's a couple other guys in that secondary list that for reasons, there was reasons why they're in the secondary list, but you hire that guy and all of a sudden you're thinking, man, you got yourself a guy. Let's go. Let's roll, man. We let's do something. And so that's the encouraging thing. So I don't know if there is a top guy, and that's God's honest truth. God's honest truth. I wholeheartedly don't believe that there's a top guy. I really think it's a group of guys that Marcus Freeman likes. God's honest truth. However, if he did have a top guy, I probably wouldn't say it right now because it would be ill-advised. Because what if that guy says no? Here's the problem with getting your list in order. Okay, here's my top 5, and I'm going to give them an order. And then you have to hire number 5 because the top 4 turned you down, or you couldn't make it work, or you couldn't afford to buy out, or whatever. Then it looks like you got passed up by 4 guys. And that's not a good look. Right. And so I think that's why it would be smart for a coach not to tell people in the media. And I would encourage you to not necessarily buy if you hear someone say, this is the top guy. Right. Because the odds are right now, I'm saying this with incredible certainty. There is not a guy right now that I think Marcus Freeman wants above all others. I think there's about 3 or 4 that he wants above all others. That's what I think.
Because the process,
if he can get one of those guys, right.
Yeah.
And there's lots of guys that he respects and think do a great job. So if he can get one of those guys, I think he's going to be ecstatic with the hire. And I think fans should be as well. So, but it's a very fair question, Aaron. It doesn't often work that way unless there's like a guy that you've worked with before. Like, I know if a job comes open, I'm hiring that dude because, and for him, I think there's 3 or 4 guys like that fit that category.
And the whole Tommy Rees situation, offer, everything happened so quick too, right? It's not like this is like something that he's been like preparing for weeks. Like, Tommy's gone. Like, this just happened like that. And yeah.
I'll give an example of the names we listed. Let's say hypothetically that his top 2 guys are Mike Denbrock and Joe Moorhead. Why? Because he doesn't think Joe Brady's interested in coming back to college. So, yeah, they're not at the top of my list. But then let's say tomorrow morning he makes a phone call to Buffalo. This is all hypothetical, people, so just go with me here. And Joe Brady's surprisingly interested in the job. Well, if I just reported last night that his top 2 guys were Mike Denbrock and Joe Moorhead because he didn't think Joe Brady was a legitimate candidate, it's 100% hypothetical. Well, now all of a sudden, what I reported last night is no longer accurate. And why did he have Joe Brady at the bottom of the list? Because he didn't think he'd be interested. So why am I wasting a lot of energy on that? No, but then wait, this guy's actually interested. Or let's say this is my top guy, and I get a phone call from someone I never would have dreamed would have interest in this job. Okay, well, all of a sudden my top guy's not my top guy anymore. You get what I'm saying? So I think that's why coaches, for at least for the first 48 hours, don't necessarily go into it with, this is my top guy. That guy emerges over time. And the other thing too is you have to be careful about going into it with a top guy, because then you can convince yourself that he's the best guy, even though there may be better candidates out there. You have to try to be as open-minded as possible, because that allows the best guy to prove himself that he's the best guy. Whereas if you're already going in with kind of blinders on, like, that's my dude, then you may miss something. And I think Marcus Freeman's smart enough to know that. Very good question. Mike Campbell with a super chat. Thank you, Mike. Notre Dame is in an arms race with the SEC. Very true. Very true. Here's one, Ryan, that I wanted to ask you about. Brandon Plensner says, thoughts on Jeff Scott? Is he good enough OC by himself? I see you shaking your head no, Ryan. Do explain.
He's never moved me personally. Like, I think that he was a better part of a co-coordinator role than he is alone, right? Like, that's just kind of where it comes from. And if that is the situation you're in and it is Jeff Scott, like, let's say hypothetically Jeff Scott comes to Notre Dame, right? I just said that he's only going to be good in probably in a co-coordinator role, but then I need to figure out who's the co-coordinator, right? Is that Dylan McCullough as a run game coordinator? Is it Jared Parker as a co-OC? Like, I just think there's too many moving parts.
Is it Harry as the run game coordinator?
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And I just think there's too many moving parts when there's much easier answers out there than Jeff Scott, in my opinion. And Jeff Scott, just honestly, for me, Brandon, like, just doesn't move me much, man. Like, he just doesn't by himself. If he was a part of a great tandem, sure. I think Jeff Scott's a really smart guy, and I think he can call an offense. But I just don't think that this is the right situation for that. Just don't.
I'll say this. I would at least entertain the idea as a co-coordinator if I missed on my top couple guys, because again, he's been a part of a great offensive run that was predicated, I think, a lot on having great players. I think he was the strong part of that and you and I had this conversation privately. I don't know if it was. I always felt Tony Elliott was the weaker link of that group. I've never been impressed with Tony Elliott.
I think Tony Elliott has also proved that to be a fact at this point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, Jeff Scott didn't have success as a head coach. I don't care. I've said this before. I never care what a guy does as a head coach. It is a completely different animal. He is a lot like some of these other guys we've talked about. He is grown up in the game. He played at Clemson. He's still 42. His dad was a head coach, right? I mean, his dad was the head coach at South Carolina, right? Wasn't so I mean, I think Brad Scott obviously was the head coach of South Carolina for a while. I just don't think he's a head coach, and I think he took a bad job as well. So yeah, he struggled at South Florida big time as an offensive coordinator or as a head coach, but I mean, it wasn't a very good job to begin with. And just because you're not good there, but he is known as a very good recruiter. And he was a guy that was very good as a co-coordinator and was the stronger half of that co-coordinator role.
No
But
doubt.
he also did that as his alma mater. And it's a different animal to sell your alma mater than it is to sell a place like Notre Dame. I often look, I think sometimes regional fit matters a lot more than people give it credit for. And I've said this with Joe Moorhead at Mississippi State. That was not going to work because he hadn't proven himself in the South like Dan Mullen did, right? Dan Mullen had been in the South for a while when he took the Mississippi State job. Joe Moorhead had been in the Northeast his entire career. And look, I've said this about look, Randy Edsall did not forget how to coach football when he went to Maryland.
No.
Tom O'Brien did not forget how to coach football when he went to NC State. They were bad fits, personality and cultural fit wise. That's not true for everybody. Some people can fit in anywhere they go. Some people are just prototypical dudes from that region. And like I have a buddy who's from Queens, and he is the stereotypical dude from Queens, how he talks, how he interacts. Just like, he'll be on the phone and he'll be like going to a little bodega or something. And he'll be like, hold on a second. He'll say, hey, how you doing? It's hilarious. It's like, dude, you are the stereotypical New York City guy, and he would not, he'll tell you this. I don't fit into these other places. Like I'm a New York guy, right? And it's just the way that it is. Some people can move all over and be totally fine. It just depends on the person. But I don't know how Jeff Scott, who's a Southern guy, who's only ever coached in the South, would fit in a place like Notre Dame. He's coached at Blythewood High School, right? Which I'm pretty sure is in South Carolina. Pretty sure.
Okay.
All right. He's coached at Presbyterian, which is in South Carolina. He's coached at Clemson. And he's coached at South Florida.
Yeah.
He's from Florida. His dad coached at South Carolina. How's he going to fit in South Bend, Indiana? I don't know. Right. And maybe wonderfully well, Ryan, maybe. But I just get a little nervous when I've seen guys only coach in the South and then how would they do in South Bend, Indiana. It makes me a little bit nervous.
And then there's people like me that can just fit in anywhere, like any country, any region.
Of course, because you've lived in so many other places in your life. Because there's New Jersey, 5 minutes in Frostburg, Maryland, and then New Jersey. Right? I mean, do I have all your places you've lived down, Pat?
When you fit in, you don't need to test the waters, man. You just know. Just know.
Yeah. All right. Let's get to the next one. All right. We had that one. Here's one from Katie Keevers. So Katie and John are both in the show tonight. Katie, first of all, I got to ask, did you guys get your mugs? I'm curious about that, if you guys got your mugs tonight. But Katie's question is, I'm a little bit nervous that Dylan McCullough leaves if he doesn't get the nod for OC. Kind of like the Elson situation, any worry about further turnover in the offensive side of the ball? I think it's a fair thing to bring up. Does Jared Parker not like it if he gets the co-OC job? I think there's only two coaches you're worried about in that regard, Katie. It's Coach McCullough and Coach Parker. They're the only ones that I'd be worried about. Yeah. Do I think that they'll be upset if they don't get it? I don't know. I don't know either of them really that well. I definitely don't know Coach McCullough that well. Maybe he would and he'd want to leave. I don't know. I don't think that would bother him though, because I think Dylan McCullough's aspirations are much bigger than coordinator. And I don't know how much being a co-coordinator or whatever the case may be would really advance it. He wants to be head football coach. And maybe being a coordinator does that. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But if he did leave because he was upset about that, I mean, that'd be a bummer, but I think they'd be fine. There's some really good running back coaches that would be. Let me just say this, Ryan. There's a lot of running back coaches who would love to coach behind Harry Heastan. That's just a fact. Yes. That is a fact. So I think they'd end up being okay, Katie. I do. Yeah. You have a super chat here from Brandon Plesner. Ryan, with Tommy Rees to Alabama, do you expect Alabama to shift some recruiting focus towards the Chicago and the surrounding area, or is Rees going to have to get familiar with the South? Yeah, they will. They've already offered Justin Scott. I mean, they offered him before. Yeah. Alabama will go anywhere to get the guys they want. Anyway, Khalil Billingsley, the tight end, was from Chicago area that they got a couple years ago.
Well, no, I was going to I think that it's hit perfectly. I mean, Brandon, they're going to go wherever they need to go, right? Like, I don't think there's any limit to where Alabama will go for a player. And I think That Tommy Rees definitely doesn't change that. I mean, like Brian said, they've already offered Justin Scott. They'll go up to anywhere to find an elite football player. I mean, they've offered the Smith twins in Connecticut, right? Like they don't care. They're going to find great football players. That's what Alabama does. So yeah, I don't think that changes anything in the philosophy or the structure of how you work your process. I think the process stays the same.
All right, let's get to the next one here, Ryan. From Robert Thidoff. This is Brian and Ryan. If Tommy leaves right after the Gator Bowl, is it better or worse for the program? Worse. Look,
yeah.
To me, well, no, I'm sorry, because the signing day, I'm always in the standpoint of signing day has to come. They've already had signing day. So
yeah.
Worse, I'll say it's worse from this standpoint. I don't know if they get Sam Hartman if he leaves right after the bowl game.
That's fair.
Because Sam Hartman had already committed to, he'd already kind of, we knew he was coming at that point in time. That would have been a big shakeup before he made his decision. And it had been so hard to get a new coach hired by the time spring practice or by the time the spring semester started. So I think it'd have been worse. What do you think, Ryan?
I think that the way it happened personally was almost the best case scenario, as weird as that sounds, because I just don't think that. I think if the timing was right after the season ended, right, it would have just been that, that season's finally over with. Let's eject button. Let's get it going here. I think that there was full intention from Tommy Rees to be a part of the program to moving forward, right? To be the help to push them to a national title and to do everything that he's talked about doing at Notre Dame. I think the fact that it happens now just says that this was the offer that just changed it a little bit, so I don't think, because I think honestly, Brian, if it happened right after the season, the whole concept would be like, oh, he was always going to leave. He hated it there, like he wanted to get out.
Didn't respect Coach Freeman. Right.
Exactly. The fact that it happened like this with Alabama, and I think that just says that there was an offer that could move him, and it did, right? But I don't think that says anything negative about what Coach Rees thought about the program or the future of the program. I do think ultimately it shows that there was buy-in from him to where the program could go, which is ultimately Alabama was enough to make that decision change.
Yeah. I think the timing was fine. Later, because again, Sam Hartman's in class and good to go. Good to go there. But very at first I was thinking, I got thrown off a little bit with the timing, but yeah, the early signing period already happened. That's what I was worried about.
Yep.
But yeah, it's so weird still. It's so weird.
And maybe if you're a team like Oregon that's still active up until the second signing day, maybe it's a different conversation.
Right.
Obviously, right?
They were done. So, they were done. SkyShark425 with Super Chat. Does Harry Hiestand go with Tommy Rees? No. Number one, they already have a really good offensive line coach at Alabama. Number two, Harry Hiestand is not going to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Just get that out of the way right now. He had a job in the SEC one. Yeah. Trust me, Harry hated coaching in the SEC. Believe that, because when he was at Tennessee.
I was going to say, talk about not a good cultural fit. That's probably not a good cultural fit.
No. Yes, not a fit. But fair question, though, because of the relationship that him and Tommy had. It's a very fair question, Sky Shark. It's just, no, not happening. Octavio Roca. I know it's all going to depend on who's the new OC, but how do expectations for next season change for you? I mean, you kind of answered your own question, and thank you for the super chat, Octavio. But for me, if they make a good hire, like one of the first group that we talked about, or maybe a couple of the other guys, then they don't change at all. And honestly, depending on who they hire, it could go up. If there's a couple names that you and I mentioned that where I'm like, I don't know if that would maybe move the needle for me. If they get someone outside of the category, maybe someone we're not fired up about, or we think would be a good job, then it could lower expectations. But right now, based on the names I've been told, based on the names that we're looking at that would make sense, guys that have a relationship with Coach Freeman and some of these other things, if they get one of those early guys that we're looking at, Ryan, if anything, the needle moves up a little bit. The only drawback is they don't know these kids all that well. But, man, I'm telling you right now, like, look, this is no shot at Tommy Rees, but there's guys on the board for us that have far significantly better proven track records than Coach Rees does.
For sure.
And so if you can get one of those guys, oh man, absolutely.
I mean, Brian, I would qualify it to a couple of my conversations yesterday with some of the commits in the class, right? Where they just said, I trust this staff to find a great offensive coordinator, right? Like I had someone almost word for word say that to me. And I think that for me, it doesn't change anything at all because I mean, you look at the talent that Notre Dame has coming back, right? You have the grad transfer quarterback. You have all the young players that played last year that are now a year older. I believe in this staff first and foremost, but I also believe in the talent that Notre Dame has in the room, right? So as long as you make a good hire, it doesn't change it at all for me. It doesn't, because I think that Notre Dame has so much talent and such a good staff, just over encompassing that the standard stays the same. And the standard can't change, right? If you make a hire where it's like, wow, I don't think we're going to be as good, like that's a failure, man. Like it should never happen at Notre Dame. It should never happen.
Agree. Good stuff, Ryan. Very good points. Milton Fan 15 is super chat. Thank you. Is Notre Dame better, worse off without Tommy Rees? Look, they're not going to be better off without Tommy Rees from the standpoint that I take this question to mean. And here's what I don't want to do. I don't want to start like taking shots at Tommy Rees and stuff like that. Are they better off? I have a hard time saying that because it sounds like I'm saying, screw that guy. They're better off without him. I felt that way about Jeff Quinn. I felt that way about Brian Poley. I don't necessarily feel that way. I think what you're going to say, Ryan, is can you upgrade over Tommy Rees? Absolutely, you can. I mean, he's a smart young offensive coordinator that Ryan and I were both, we'll see. But, boy, if he can put it all together, he shows some promise to be really, really good. We'll see if he can put it together or not. But also at the same time, but he hadn't put it all together just yet. Right. And there's other guys that have that, could maybe upgrade it a little bit. But I don't want to say it that way in a way that makes it look like I'm like, of course they're going to be better off without Tommy Rees. But I also don't want to say they're worse off. Are there hires they could make that would be worse than where they were with Tommy Rees? Absolutely. A lot of them. Yeah. You hope they don't make that hire. So I look at it like this, Milton Fan, and I don't think, knowing him, I don't think he means this as like a screw Tommy Rees. Milton Fan, I don't think really posts like that. It's just, I didn't want to answer it that way because I thought it might come across that way. Sure. Notre Dame has an opportunity to upgrade. And I don't say that as a shot at Tommy Rees. It's just there's some guys with connections to Marcus Freeman or some guys that are out there to be had that would move the needle further along. They are now what Tommy Rees could be in 2 to 3 years or maybe next year or the year after or whatever the case may be. They are already proven to be that. And so, that's encouraging. But if they don't get one of those guys and they have to settle for somebody else, then you're not as good. And that's the territory Marcus Freeman's going into, Ryan, is that right there. It's you got to make this hire work. And that means Notre Dame, the institution, has to give Marcus Freeman the resources he needs to go out and make whatever hire he needs to make. Money better not be an issue for Notre Dame if they have the right guy, right? It better not be. It's just you got to make sure you get that right guy. That's the big thing.
And that's all I took it as from that question is just the simple fact of, is there a guy out there that could upgrade the offensive coordinator position? I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There is that guy. And it's no shot against Tommy Rees. It's just we talked about a lot of guys tonight that are very good offensive minds, can call a good football game, and are also really good recruiters, right? So, yes, there's an opportunity to upgrade that position for sure.
Yeah. Did you see the comment from Ryan B?
No.
Look at it at the 11:13 mark. Okay. I'm not pulling it up because it's mean, but it's also really funny. Let's get to the next question here. Charlie Weiss's last belt loop says, Coach, I know there's a lot of did you see it, Ryan?
Yes, I saw it. That's their first target.
Coach, I know there's a lot of speculation, but any fear that they get an OC who is a terrible recruiter despite not being a great OC? It feels like Freeman might be on double duty if that's the case. Yeah, that's a concern. It's just, look, you can't bring in a coach that's going to recruit the same effort that Al Golden's doing. You can't. You don't also have to bring in someone that's going to grind on the trail the way that Marcus Freeman did as a D coordinator or Tommy Rees did this last year. There can be a happy medium where the results kind of speak for themselves and that coordinator kind of comes in and he's the closer. He recruits the way that Harry Hiestand does, which is, look, man, Do you want to go there? Yeah, it's a nice coach, good place. Or do you want to come here where I turn Joe Burrow into the most productive single season quarterback in history, and I just turn Sam Hartman into a Heisman finalist, right? Or do you want to, so like that, Joe Burrow, I think, is the name that I think of, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Joe Moorhead's the greatest recruiter ever. I don't know if he's that grinder on the recruiting trail, but you've got great grinders around you, Deland, Chansey, Jared Parker. You go put the results on the field and then be the closer, and that'll work. But I don't think Al Golden's even doing that. That's the concern. He's not even doing that. And the results on the field weren't good enough to sell. You come in here, score 40 points a game next year. Notre Dame's a playoff team. Results speak for themselves, right? I mean, they just had a great offensive class. They scored 30 points a game. Right. Notre Dame offensively this year, just offense, scored 30.2 points per game this year. That's it. Offensive touchdowns, extra points, and field goals. And some of those touchdowns are like you get the ball at the 2 against Syracuse to start a drive. You get 2 yards in 4 plays to score a touchdown, right? You get the ball at the 11-yard line, gets Benjamin Morrison, picks off Cade Klubnik, right? So let's be real. They were aided by their defense more than the offense aided the defense, if we're being real about it. And they still signed a great offensive class. You go out there next year and score 40 game and win 11, 12, 13 games, Ryan, and all of a sudden it's like dudes are lining up to come play for you.
Yes.
You can't be useless on a recruiting trail, but you don't got to be the world's greatest grinder either at that point in time as the OC.
I mean, Brian, I keep thinking about the wide receiver class that they just signed with their leading wide receiver having 300-something yards. It's like, can you imagine if next year they have 1,000 yards?
If you Ryan, you remember when you talked to the recruits afterwards, and then I would reach out to some. You'd have thought the way they acted after Notre Dame beat Clemson, I'm talking the receivers, the way they acted after Notre Dame beat Clemson, you'd have thought Notre Dame threw for 400 yards.
Throw for 90 or whatever they did.
They threw for 86. And they were still fired up about playing in this offense because they have this mentality of, dude, it's Notre Dame, number one. And number two, it's like we can come there and we can do this, and this. But imagine if you don't have to convince them of what you can do with them, if you can just point to, look what we've already doing. And then imagine what we could do with you. Like, we're already nasty. Then imagine what we can do with you. You'll be able to sell a lot more. Definitely. Here's a question from Christopher Morgan. Thank you for the super chat, Christopher Morgan, very much. Haven't seen you post in a little bit either, man. So glad to see you back asking questions. He says, hello, IB Nation. Sorry I've not chimed in for a while. Just grinding out 60 hours a week since my promotion. Congratulations, by the way. Trying to catch up on coaching moves, thoughts on a possible new OC, which we kind of got into here during the show. And I'll say this, Ryan. For me, I'm just not as long as they hire someone that is from a top group, and there may be some names we add to it. And here's the thing we'll promise y'all too. If we hear other names, we will talk about them in future shows. We're not going to be like, well, this is the OC talk. So if you don't like hear it now, then we're not going to talk about it. If we hear more names, we'll talk. Well, first place we'll talk about it's on the message board. So that's why you got to sign up for the message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. But we'll also talk about it in shows. But I think this is the group I feel comfortable with right now. As long as they get a guy from that group we talked about, Ryan, I'm happy. I really am. I really am.
I would be happy with all the top 4 that we talked about. I mean, I honestly would be kind of happy with a couple others after that. But
yeah, like Jason Candle we've talked about. Yeah. Like, you've got me sold on Jason Candle, man. Like, okay,
I like Jason Candle, right? Man. I like Jason Candle. But that top 4 group, I mean, it's hard. I mean, again, we're talking about like guys like Andy Ludwig, who has done incredible things at Utah. We're talking about a couple incredible minds like Joe Brady and Moorhead. And yeah, I don't think you can go wrong with that top group. I really don't. It's a really talented and really smart group of coaches.
Yep. Absolutely. Here we go. We got another super chat here from Octavio Roca. He says, what players on offense benefit the most from this? Chris, Eli, Merriweather. Yeah. Again, Octavio, I'm not trying to be a cop-out, but I got to know who they're hiring first.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Like, I got to know that part of this is track record, right? Do they bring in a coach that has a track record of developing multiple backs on one offense? Well, I mean, that's going to kind of tell me a little something. If they're bringing a guy that doesn't, then I may not feel as great about it, right? I mean, so – like, I love Joe Moorhead, right? I think he's a heck of a coach, but he had Miles Sanders on his team, and he only got him 191 rushing yards. because he focused so much on Saquon Barkley. Well, that's a knock for me there. I'd want to know, talking to him in the interview process, okay, how are you going to get all these backs involved? Now he may say, hey, look, that's just not how our offense worked back then because Trace was a runner and all this other, we needed, this is what we needed to do. Okay, maybe that's the case, but that's a question that I would ask. But how I feel about how he's going to use 3 backs there is going to be a whole lot different than how is Andy Ludwig going to use 3 backs, because I've seen him do it. I've seen Andy Ludwig have success with multiple backs in one season.
Yes.
And so I've seen Mike Denbrock spread the ball around in different ways. But then with Mike Denbrock, there's other areas where, I think Joe Moorhead may be a little better over here. And so that's why it's hard for me to say who benefits the most because of this. Tobias Merriweather is going to benefit from whoever they hire as long as it's a good hire because he's going to be a year older.
Yes.
And I'll say this, the entire offensive group as a whole is going to benefit from this at the very least from a mindset standpoint, because it ups the guys who are already starters can't rest on their laurels because there's a new OC and you got to prove yourself all over again. It's not a bad thing. The younger players that may feel buried are going to feel like I get another chance to make a new impression on a new coach who doesn't care about who started last year. I get my chance. And I think that's a healthy thing, Ryan. That's one of the positives of coaching turnover. It's not that I love it all the time, but it's one of the positives in my opinion. Milton Fan says, Coach, which coach is best for Chris Tyree? Well, I think the first one that stands out to me is probably Joe Brady, just because Chris Tyree has a lot of Clyde Edwards-Helaire traits in that dual threat type of realm. They're not a direct comparison. They're a little different. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a little shiftier and Chris is faster and all that stuff. But as far as he liked using the running backs in the pass game, he had a little small guy that could use effectively in the pass game. Chris Tyree fits that pretty well. And it was a lot of the stuff he did was out of the backfield. I think of the corner route he caught for a touchdown against Bama in 19. It was out of the backfield. Just kind of came here, did a corner route out of the backfield, just a really good concept that I really liked. Joe Burrow hit him perfectly between 2 guys. So I think probably Joe Brady would be the best for Chris Tyree. But that's based on but Andy Ludwig didn't have a guy like Chris Tyree. So maybe he would use him differently if he had a guy like that. But of the guys we've looked at, I'd say probably Joe Brady would be the best for Chris Tyree. What do you think, Ryan?
I mean, I'm just kind of looking through the list a little bit. It's interesting, man. It really is. Who's honestly would probably be pretty good with Chris Tyree is Liam Cohen, honestly, with what he did with Wan'Dale Robinson, kind of with that running back, wide receiver background, kind of use him in space a little bit. Like, it's not a direct one-for-one comparison because Wan'Dale was much more wide receiver at Kentucky than he was at Nebraska, for instance, right? Yeah. But he's kind of shown me that he can kind of manipulate space a little bit with some of those guys, the Wan'Dale Robinsons of the world. So Liam's just a guy that popped in my head just because I've seen that similar body type-ish that he's kind of used as well.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. And then we did have a question here about a name here, Ryan, from Jason Smith. I've seen this one. Andrew Sauter. Is he any good? So just a little background. Andrew Sauter just recently got hired at was he at Kent State, correct? He was at Kent State before, but he recently got hired at
he was the OC under
Kent State.
Sean Lewis or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, correct. Because Sean Lewis was the head coach, right?
Yeah. He called a lot of the offense, though. Sean Lewis did. Yeah.
Right. Andrew Sauter was the offensive coordinator. Now, they had a big step back the last couple of years offensively.
Yeah.
But he just got hired as the tight ends coach at Minnesota. So he's already kind of moved on from Kent State. And, I think to Ryan's point, I think Sean Lewis was the driver of that.
He was.
He's more Jeff Lebby than he is the, other guy, Andy Ludwig, who calls the offense. He's more of the coordinator, but the other guy has a bigger say, and the head coach has a bigger say in it. So,
man, Kent State lost a lot this offseason, by the way. We didn't really lost their quarterback, their 2 best receivers, their offensive coordinator. Yeah. Like, they lost
and they weren't that good to begin with.
Exactly.
Although they had their AD needs to be fired. You made your football teams play at Washington, at Oklahoma, and at Georgia in the first month of the season.
Hey, man, they got paid. They got paid.
No, that's not yet. Right. I mean, and that's why he won't get fired. Yeah. But that's so unfair to those kids.
Oh yeah.
So unfair to those kids. Like you're dead. You're just completely worn as a player by the time you get to October 1st. It was a bad. Really
Sean Lewis is like, I'm out of here, man.
Screw this. If I'm going to have to play these teams every week, I'm going to go to a team where I have that on my roster.
Right.
Who hired him, by the way? Who hired Sean Lewis?
UCLA? Did UCLA hire Sean Lewis? I could be wrong.
I'm going to look that up real quick.
Colorado.
Dion did. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, Dion did.
That's a good hire, by the way. I like that hire a lot. Yeah.
Yep. No doubt. All right, let's get to last super chat here. We have Love Milton fan. Thank you, man. Love IB. You guys are outstanding. I appreciate that. Appreciate that very much, especially with some of the trolls we've had jumping into this chat tonight. I've had some ignorant things to say, but we appreciate that, man. I shouldn't even bring those up because he's showing us love, and I appreciate that. But it's nice to get these kind of comments every now and then. I'm not gonna lie to you. MAG official music. Does Joe Brady concern you with recruiting, considering he's a past NFL guy, meaning once he leaves, the recruits may flip, even if it is easy for him? He's a fire hire, but it is for years or a year. Look, I don't think the flipping thing happens as much as people think, because I had a conversation with somebody at Notre Dame about this yesterday, and the comment was, here's why the kids in the 24 class are sticking. Because we don't sell me. We don't sell Tommy Rees. We don't sell Al Golden. We sell Notre Dame. And when kids commit there, of course the coach is going to have a role. Of course, you've got to connect with the coach. But when the message is Notre Dame, not come play for me, kids aren't going to flip as much. Lincoln Riley was very much a come play for me guy at Oklahoma. So when he left, class went away. But we've seen this at Notre Dame before where coaches leave and kids don't. It's because Notre Dame is different and they sell it different. So am I concerned about him not recruiting? And that I am a bit concerned about him recruiting. I need to know that there's going to be a level of buy-in as a recruiter. I've got to know that. But then to, MAG official music's comment, it's, well, what if even if he does recruit for a period of time and then he leaves, do the kids leave too? It'll be the same answer then that I'm giving you now with Tom Rees leaving. Depends on who they hire.
Yep.
Depends on who they hire. And I think they'll make a. People got jokes in the chat now. Did you see the one from Bad Luck?
Brian Ferentz. Yeah,
well played. Tommy Guns hugs with super chat. Thank you, Tommy. I appreciate that very much, man. I appreciate that.
Big hug, Tommy. Big hug.
Yep. Digital hugs right now, man. I appreciate you. So, Ryan, that's going to be it, man. That's a lot of show today, man. A lot of show today. Yep. But I really wanted to do this show as quickly as we could. I really wanted to kind of somebody asked about Colin Klein. You and I talked about him last night. I don't talk about him because he's kind of a Kansas State lifer. But if Colin Klein was interested, I'd definitely talk to him. He's the former Kansas State quarterback, but he's been at Kansas State his whole career. You wonder, like, I always get nervous. That was my issue with Aaron Roderick from BYU. I like a lot about what he does. It just concerns me a little bit that he's never coached outside of the state of Utah. How would he fit?
I need to do more research on Colin Klein in the sense that I've seen a lot of his run game stuff, which I like the run game principles he uses a lot. I don't know what his passing game looks like, though. You know what I mean?
It's not bad, especially considering if you watch it with Will Howard, it looks even better. Because, Will Howard could do a little bit more. It's not super complex, but I don't really think it necessarily has to be. If you have the right gun. I like how he uses the backside of that. Well, I'll tell you this. Remember the question we had earlier about who benefits the most? Which coach would benefit Chris Tyree the most? Well, it's Colin
Deuce Vaughn clone.
Yeah. Right. Well, and it's not even just because Deuce Vaughn's a lot thicker than Chris Tyree. Well, not really. He runs a little bit with a more authority than Chris. But Deuce Vaughn's not a real big guy, but he not only was a dynamic player this year as a runner, he had 1,558 yards, 9 touchdowns, but he caught 42 passes. Did a lot out of the backfield. So, I could see that. In the year before, Deuce Vaughn caught 49 passes for 468 yards. So I think that would be the look. But go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, no, I was just saying I love Deuce Vaughn. That's all.
Yeah.
That's all I was going to say.
Oh, yeah.
It's so funny that he's listed at 5'6", 176. There's no chance he's 5'6".
Yeah, I know, right?
I love that kid, man. I love that kid.
But no, Ryan, I do like their pass game. It's not super complex. It's very efficient. it is, especially like when they had Skylar Thompson. I mean, he was a 69% passer his last year at Kansas State. He could just never stay healthy. That was a problem with him. He just couldn't stay healthy. But it's just not it's just not one of those things, Ryan, where they've really had the quarterback or the skill players to have an overly complex system. It just, we're going to go out there. We're going to be good at what we do. We're going to design some stuff to get guys open. They do a lot of levels, stuff like that to get guys open. It's not super complicated, but I don't think that necessarily needs to be. I think he's done a good job of getting the most out of his quarterbacks. And as you said this earlier, give me a guy that shows me they can get the most out of quarterbacks.
Yep.
And, because he's going to have way better players than Notre Dame. Notre Dame doesn't have anybody as good as Deuce Vaughn in that regards, but they've got pretty darn good running backs. Yeah, they're not like Deuce Vaughn is what I mean. They're not as good as Deuce Vaughn at what Deuce Vaughn does, but they've got some really good backs. And they've got 3 Deuce Vaughn type of impact guys, or actually, 5, where Kansas State has Deuce Vaughn, and then there's the next guy way down here. The receiving talent's going to be way better. The line's going to be way better. The thing I like about Kansas State is he maximizes the quarterbacks, and they're a very well-coached team. Now, here's the thing. That has more to do with Chris Kleiman than it does the coordinators. Yeah. That's how Chris Kleiman wants the program to be. And he's so that's
excellent, man.
Yeah, he is.
I love Chris Kleiman.
Yep, he absolutely
and Colin Klein's got Avery Johnson coming in, which should be pretty interesting to watch.
Look, the next couple years. Dude made Adrian Martinez into a good quarterback. That's literally I would almost do it as a joke, say it as a joke, but I'm kind of serious. Like I'd literally hand a resume and your resume says
made Adrian Martinez.
I made Adrian Martinez a competent quarterback.
Will Howard was balling down the stretch of the season too, man. He was looking pretty good. So yeah.
So there's that. There's going to be so many. There's going to be so many different people that are going to get thrown out there as possible names, and so much is going to be about there's just going to be these rumors and all this other nonsense that's going to come out there. So just let it play out a little bit. But I somebody just said, and I don't know if this is true or not, but somebody just said like ESPN says Ryan Grubb's a candidate for the job. Didn't y'all just tell me that ESPN said Joe Moorhead's the top candidate like 5 minutes ago? Right. So,
maybe I think we talked about this earlier, right? Like maybe Ryan Grubb is a guy that would consider, South Bend over Tuscaloosa. Like maybe he's not a Tuscaloosa guy, right?
Exactly. And that's what I was saying earlier. Exactly.
But he did just turn down Alabama, right? So I just don't know how realistic that one is.
Right. A name that I've had people bring up to me, Ryan, is Brian Johnson, the football coach.
He's interesting. He's interesting. He is.
What do you think about him? Because he was obviously he's in the NFL now, but he has a college background.
He has a college background.
Right. He was the offensive coordinator at Florida in 2020. He was a quarterback's coach for 2 years. He was the OC at Houston for a minute. Obviously, we're talking about the guy he played college at Utah. He was the offensive coordinator at Utah for a couple of years. So, he's never really had, as far as I know, any really elite offenses.
Yeah.
But he's got a good reputation as a coach.
He's got a real good reputation as a quarterback guy too, right? As far as knowing the position. Yeah, obviously that's his background. And he's learning, with the Eagles right now under Sirianni and Shane Steichen.
Right. And Alabama fans in the chat are going to have flashbacks when we start bringing up the name Brian Johnson because he handed a little beat down to the old Crimson Tide back in the Sugar Bowl after the 2008 season.
I loved that game, man.
Yeah.
I loved that game.
Yeah. I don't know enough about him as a coach to be able to say for sure what he would be. What were you going to ask?
I want to go look back at that game. There was I think there was a linebacker for Utah that had 3 or 4 sacks in that game. If I remember,
Paul Kruger?
I think that might have been before Kruger. Could be wrong.
Okay. Well, let me go look. Let me go look. I'm going to look Alabama. It was Alabama, Utah, right?
Yep. Tell us, Ladarius.
I believe
Ladarius remembers the pain.
Yeah. I think it was a Sugar Bowl. Let's go see if the box score here has it. Let's see. No defensive stats in that game. Let's see if there's a play-by-play. So, but yeah, Ryan, I thought it was Paul. It wasn't Paul Kruger, or was Paul Kruger come later?
I think Kruger's a little later than that. I think he's later.
Okay. You could be right. But let's see here. Let's see if I can find some numbers here. Let's see if I can find some defensive numbers in this game. See here. Here's who had some sacks. You had Stevenson, Sylvester. I think these might be last names. Kepa Gason. You've got Kanepe Eliapo, Boo Anderson. So they don't have. Let me get down here some more possessions here, Ryan. So because I don't have all of Alabama's possessions here, but and they got worked a little bit. Alabama tried to come back though. They just So Stevenson Sylvester, he had another sack.
Stevenson Sylvester, that's it. Okay. I remember him. He had drafted by the Steelers.
He had 3 sacks. Yeah, he had 3 sacks in that game. Yeah. So, yep, there you go. There you go. All right, Ryan. I mean, so Ryan Grubb. Just thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I love the idea of Ryan Grubb. I just don't think it's realistic at all. I mean, again, like if he just wasn't willing to, take the offer with Alabama, I just question if he's ready to move away from it right now. So that's just my opinion.
I also get nervous. Go ahead, Ryan. I'm sorry, man.
No, that's it. I was done.
I always get nervous when you're talking about a coordinator who's coaching for a great offensive mind as the head coach. I always get nervous about that because you just never know where the real success came from. That was a little bit of my issue with Garrett Riley. I think Garrett Riley did a great job at TCU this year, but how much of that is him on his own, or how much is that Sonny Dykes? People have brought up Zach Kitley. You're not going to run an air raid offense. That's too big of a transition. I don't think it really fits really well. People have talked about, they ran the ball well at their this year. They ran for 159 yards, and that was their rushing yards out of necessity because of all the injuries they had at quarterback. I just the air raid's just probably not going to be a thing. It's just not going to be a thing. Somebody brought up Will Stein. He was just hired by Oregon. Yep. He's not leaving Oregon to come to Notre Dame. That's a good hire. So that was a good hire for them. He was a guy at UTSA. Now, another name I was brought up by a fan was Barry Lunney, who was the UTSA offensive coordinator before him. He's the OC at Illinois. It's really hard to evaluate him at Illinois because they had no quarterback. I mean, their quarterback situation was awful this year, but they ran the ball really well.
Their quarterback made the East-West Shrine game, okay? So I don't know what you're talking about. The legend of Tommy DeVito, man. Jersey,
I know,
great.
Right? And I'll tell you what, man. The kid that was the backup, and I'm drawing a blank on his name, Artur Sikowski. I saw him as a junior, and I'm like, this kid spins it as well as anybody in the country. Because I saw him at camps, and then you're like, dude, this guy has a bazooka. And then you watch him try to read a defense, and you're like, yeah, this is going to be a problem.
I remember he went to IMG Academy for his last year, and he threw more interceptions than touchdowns as a senior.
Yeah. In high school. Yeah, yes. And he got benched at IMG. Remember that? That was bad. Yep. Somebody said Andy Kotelnicki. He's the OC at Kansas. I think he does some really nice things. Their quarterback play was really efficient this year with 2 completely different types of quarterbacks, in my opinion, like a short athletic guy, then a tall, long-armed athletic guy, all that kind of stuff. But I don't think that's the right fit from what I've talked to. It's probably not a guy they're going to look at right now. He's also a guy that's kind of a Lance Leopold guy, in my opinion. And TJ, I'm not going into that one, man. That's not happening. But I mean, those are some names because Ryan and you and I talked about Kotelnicki last night, and I liked some of the stuff. Kotelnicki, maybe is how you say it, but Kotelnicki, if that's his name. He did some nice things this year. I just don't know if he's got enough on the resume to make me want to. Yeah. It's a similar thing like your issue with Liam Cohen a little bit. Mm-hmm. But I think the scheme transition for Cohen would be a lot smoother than for Kotelnicki because it's more of a spread offense, right, as opposed to a pro style. So that's really kind of the reason he was not a guy that we fully went with at this point in time. So, Ryan, you brought up Kevin Johns. He did a really nice job with Duke this year, but he was bad at Memphis, and he wasn't very good at Northwestern. Those are my concerns with him. I mean, Memphis kind of they went off the cliff with him as OC. Now, part of that could have been the head coaching problem. But I'll tell you what, though, he bounced back and did a really nice job with Duke this year with Riley Leonard. So
they had a
really nice offense with this year. But
They did.
just to me, there's too much on his resume that I don't like. John McNulty is a no for me. Nice guy. John McNulty is a perfect example to me of he's a much better position coach than he is a coordinator. He's a much better in your ear of the offensive coordinator, assisting the offensive coordinator than he is being an offensive coordinator. Now, I don't judge that based on what he did at BC this year because they were completely hamstrung. I mean,
Right.
we're making excuses for Tommy Rees because he lost Tyler Buckner and Avery Davis. Don't even get me started on all the problems they had personnel-wise at BC this year. I mean, it was rough.
Yes.
So I don't really hold that against him too much. And I think he was Jeff Hafley's scapegoat, to be honest with you, if I'm going to be real with you. But even with that being said, I just don't think John McNulty's that guy.
And he's also a tight end coach, so you have to figure out the formation of the staff again, type of thing. So
right, and he's coached receivers before, but it's the same concern. And Mike Denbrock's proven enough to me to try to make it work. John McNulty's not. Yep. His success at Rutgers was okay. I liked his track record at Rutgers from the standpoint of being a helper to the OC, but not as the OC. Jamarcus Shepard, that's going to be a no-go. We've dug into that one. That one's going to be a no-go. The fit's just not going to work. He was a pass game coordinator at Washington. So those are a lot of the different names that we've heard, Ryan, and I think
someone just say
what's
Norm Chow?
Isn't he like 80-something years old? Like Norm Chow is up there, man. And he was not that good at his last couple jobs. So I was close. He was 76. And he is currently the head coach for the Helvetic Guards, which is an American football team based in Zurich, Switzerland. So to answer the question that somebody said, what is he up to these days? That is what Norm Chow is up to these days. So
someone said Charlie Strong, who's a defensive coach.
Defensive coach. Y'all are past your bedtime. Willie Taggart, heck to the no. Tony Elliott might be looking for a way out of UVA. He can look for the way out of UVA all he wants. He ain't coming here.
Yeah.
Heck no. That would be terrible. Somebody said he's Ted Lassoing it up. He's Ted Lassoing it up. That's great. Oh my goodness gracious. That's going to do it for tonight's show because otherwise Tom Herman was just hired as a head coach somewhere else. If he just got hired as a head coach at Florida Atlantic, he ain't coming to Notre Dame. Nor would I want him at Notre Dame. Great offensive mind, not the greatest human being on the planet. So I'll pass a little bit on that one. So that's going to definitely do it for tonight's show, Ryan. We are going to get out of here. We've been on here for about 6 hours today, so it's time for us to check out. It is way past Ryan's bedtime at this point in time. So that's going to do it for us tonight, y'all. Thank y'all so much tonight. Great chat conversation. Thank you all for the super chats. We appreciate that greatly. Tomorrow, Saturday at noon, Ryan and I will be back. So we're turning this sucker around quick because Leonard Moore, the cornerback from Texas, is going to be making his commitment at noon tomorrow. We may have an RTF show tomorrow. It depends on how my voice is and just a couple other things. I'm going to try to interview some editors this weekend and into Monday, Tuesday. So some of y'all that I've talked to about that, I will be reaching out over the next day or two about those open opportunities because we are going to start we're going to get back on to that interview process for that as well. But Ryan, you and I will cover that Leonard Moore decision tomorrow. We'll see where he's going to go and talk about what it means for Notre Dame one way or the other. You can also make sure y'all hit that like button before we leave, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast if you're listening via podcast platform. We'd greatly appreciate a 5-star review. Sign up for the message boards at boards@irishbreakdown.com. Take care of yourselves. Give your family members a hug. All the people you care about, give them a hug. Let them know that you love them. Never take that next day for granted. For Ryan, I'm Brian. Thank y'all so much. Talk to you again on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.